It began with roads that all led to the same place. In the heart of the Ardennes, Bastogne sat quietly at the center of a web of narrow, winding routes that cut through forest and frozen farmland. In peacetime, those roads meant little, paths for farmers, traders, travelers moving slowly through the hills. But in December of 1944, those roads became arteries of war. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled movement across a vast stretch of the Ardennes, and in a battle built on speed, fuel, and momentum, that control meant everything. Winter had already closed its grip around the region. Snow lay deep in the forests, muting sound and distorting distance. The cold was sharp and unrelenting, seeping through boots, gloves, and skin until it settled in bone. Fog rolled in without warning, swallowing entire units and turning familiar ground into uncertainty. The Ardennes looked quiet, deceptively so, and that quiet was one of the reasons the German offensive struck, where it did. When the Ardennes Offensive began, it came with violence and surprise that tore holes in thin American lines. Units were scattered, communications collapsed, roads clogged with retreat and advance at the same time. German armor surged westward through snow and fog, aiming to break through before the Allies could understand what was happening. Bastogne was not the original objective, but it quickly became unavoidable. As German columns advanced, they discovered what maps had already shown. Every major road in the region bent toward Bastogne. Bypassing it meant risking supply lines. Capturing it meant unlocking the west. And so, almost inevitably, Bastogne became the center of gravity for the battle. American forces moved into the town under pressure and confusion. Some arrived by chance. Others were rushed in deliberately as the scale of the offensive became clear. Among them were airborne units who had expected rest, not another fight. They arrived without winter, gear, without full supplies, without preparation for siege. What they had was discipline, cohesion, and the instinct to hold ground when everything else was uncertain. The noose tightened quickly. German forces encircled Bastogne from multiple directions, cutting roads, seizing villages, and isolating the town in a pocket of frozen forest. Artillery fire rained down day and night, shaking buildings and shattering trees. Shells burst in streets, fields, and foxholes scraped into frozen earth. Smoke drifted low, trapped beneath cloud cover that grounded Allied aircraft and sealed Bastogne off from help. Inside the pocket, conditions worsened by the hour. Ammunition ran low, medical supplies dwindled, food was rationed. The wounded piled up in makeshift aid stations, where cold threatened lives as much as injuries. Men slept in snow-filled foxholes, in cellars, in ruined buildings that offered little protection from artillery or frost. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. The cold gnawed at morale, but it did not break it. German attacks came repeatedly. Infantry advanced through forests under covering fire. Tanks pushed along roads toward the town, probing for weakness. Each assault tested the perimeter, searching for a crack that could be widened. Each was met with determined resistance. Small units holding critical points, artillery firing until barrels glowed, anti-tank teams waiting until armor was close enough that escape was impossible. The defenders understood what holding Bastogne meant. If they broke, the German offensive could regain momentum. If they held, they could choke it. And so they held, not because it was easy, but because there was no alternative. The siege became a battle of endurance. Days blurred together in cold and exhaustion. Messages were sent and lost. Rumors spread faster than facts. When German envoys arrived demanding surrender, the response was brief, defiant, and instantly symbolic. But behind that confidence lay grim reality. Bastogne was surrounded, undersupplied, and under constant attack. Relief was uncertain. Survival depended on holding long enough for something, anything, to change. And then, slowly, it did. The weather began to break. Clouds thinned, skies cleared, the sound of aircraft returned. Allied planes roared overhead, dropping supplies into fields marked with panels and smoke. Ammunition, food, medical gear fell from the sky, turning desperation into possibility. Morale lifted not because the danger had passed, but because the defenders were no longer alone. Outside the pocket, movement surged. American forces fought through snow and forest to reach Bastogne, grinding forward against stiff resistance. Roads were contested mile by mile. Villages changed hands. Artillery thundered constantly. Tanks burned along frozen lanes. Progress was slow, costly, and relentless. When relief finally arrived, it did not end the battle, but it changed its direction. The siege was broken. The pocket opened. German momentum faltered. Bastogne remained contested ground for weeks, battered by continued fighting, but its survival marked a turning point. The German offensive, built on speed and surprise, had been forced into a prolonged struggle it could not sustain. Fuel ran out, losses mounted, initiative shifted. The Battle of Bastogne became more than a tactical engagement. It became a symbol, not of perfection, but of endurance under impossible conditions, of ordinary soldiers holding because they understood what failure would mean, of a town that absorbed the weight of an offensive and refused to collapse. When the fighting finally moved on, Bastogne was scarred deeply. Buildings were shattered, fields were torn apart, roads were lined with wreckage, but the crossroads remained. And so did the lesson. The Battle of Bastogne mattered because it bought time, because it disrupted momentum, because it turned a gamble into a liability. It showed how logistics, terrain, weather, and resolve intersect to shape history. And it reminded the world that even in the coldest, darkest moments, outcomes can hinge on the decision to endure just a little longer. Tonight, we return to Bastogne, to the frozen forests and battered roads, to the siege that tested human limits, to the town that became a fortress not by design, but by necessity, to the battle that stood at the center of winter and refused to give way. Before we continue deeper into this story, I want to ask you something quiet and personal. Where in the world are you listening from right now? And what hour has settled around you? Is it late and still, or does the night feel restless? And one final, gentle invitation for tonight. If these long, immersive journeys into history help you slow down, reflect, or feel quietly accompanied as the world grows quiet, consider subscribing. And let these stories stay with you when the night deepens. September 18th, 1944. Bastogne dozed in the afternoon sun like a Belgian market town that had seen too much history and wanted only to be forgotten. 4,000 civilians watched American supply trucks rumble through their cobblestone square at the rate of one every 30 seconds, heading east toward Germany. The drivers barely glanced at the medieval buildings with their shattered windows and patched roofs. They didn't know the name of this place. They wouldn't have cared if someone told them. In 4 months, this unremarkable crossroads would become the most famous town in Europe, and many of these drivers would die trying to reach it. The town sat in a shallow bowl surrounded by the dark forests of the Ardennes, a region the French called Fortress Europe's Attic, because nothing important ever happened there. 7 roads converged on Bastogne's central square like spokes on a wagon wheel, an accident of medieval geography where cattle traders once met to exchange livestock. Route Nationale 4 ran east to west, connecting Luxembourg to Brussels. Route Nationale Quince branched north toward Liège. Route Nationale 30 stretched south to Arlon. 4 smaller roads filled the gaps between them, creating a transportation hub that military planners marked on their maps with a simple dot. The dot meant nothing in September. By December, men would die for every yard of those roads. General Troy Middleton stood in the 8 Corps headquarters building on the northeastern edge of town, studying a map that showed his impossible task. His corps held an 80-mile front line with just 4 divisions, stretched so thin that platoons defended positions that should have required companies. The Ardennes was where the U.S. Army sent green divisions to learn combat in a quiet sector, or exhausted divisions to recover from savage fighting. Middleton commanded both types, and he knew what his superiors in Paris and London thought of this posting. They called the Ardennes the Ghost Front because nothing ever happened there. They were wrong, but they wouldn't discover their mistake until it was almost too late. The supply convoys rolling through Bastogne carried the fuel and ammunition that would push the Allied armies into Germany by Christmas. 400,000 gallons of gasoline passed through the town each day, enough to move entire armored divisions. Ration trucks brought food for 500,000 soldiers. Ammunition convoys hauled shells that would flatten German cities. The logistics officers who planned these routes chose Bastogne because 7 roads made it impossible to avoid, not because they expected anyone to fight for it. The town was infrastructure, nothing more. A place trucks drove through on their way to somewhere that mattered. The officers who made this calculation would spend Christmas wondering how they'd gotten it so catastrophically wrong. 50 kilometers to the east, in a farmhouse basement near the German border, Wehrmacht, Intelligence officers hunched over the same maps American planners used, but they saw something different. Major Friedrich von der Heide traced his finger along the 7 roads and smiled the way a chess player smiles when he spots his opponent's fatal mistake. Everything the Americans needed flowed through this one insignificant town. Cut those roads, and you didn't just stop supplies, you paralyzed entire armies. Von der Heide had spent 4 years fighting across Europe, and he'd learned that modern war moved on roads the way medieval war moved on rivers. Control the crossroads, control the battlefield. He marked Bastogne with a red circle and wrote a single word in the margin: unentbehrlich, indispensable. The German planners weren't just studying Bastogne's present, they were calculating its future. Winter was coming, and with it, the kind of weather that grounded aircraft and turned the Ardennes forests into something from a Gothic nightmare. The Americans had grown comfortable in their superiority, flying thousands of planes every day, dropping supplies wherever they needed them. But what if the weather turned? What if the skies stayed dark for a week, 2 weeks, and those 7 roads became the only way to move anything? Von der Heide drew arrows on his map showing panzer divisions converging on Bastogne from 3 directions. He calculated that the Americans would need at least 12 hours to realize what was happening, another 12 to respond. By then, it would be too late. The town would be surrounded, the roads would be cut, and the entire American position in Belgium would begin to collapse. In the town itself, life continued with the strange normalcy of military occupation. Juliette Henrard, who ran a cafe on the square, served coffee to American soldiers who didn't speak French and tried to pay with chocolate bars instead of francs. Her husband had died in the Great War fighting Germans in these same forests, and now Germans were coming again. And these Americans seemed so young, so confident, so certain that the war was almost over. She wanted to warn them that the Ardennes had betrayed armies before, that the forest held dangers no map could show, but her English consisted of 5 words, and none of them were danger, or forest, or betrayal. So, she poured coffee and took their chocolate and wondered what kind of winter was coming. The strategic importance of Bastogne existed in a quantum state that fall, simultaneously obvious and invisible depending on who was looking. To the supply officers, it was a waypoint, a place to refuel trucks. To the frontline infantry, it was a rear area town where you might get a hot shower if you were lucky. To the generals planning the final Presto into Germany, it was so insignificant they didn't bother stationing more than a skeleton garrison there. But to the German commanders preparing Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, Bastogne was the linchpin of the entire offensive. Take it in the first 24 hours, and the panzers could race west to the Meuse River. Fail to take it, and the entire operation would bog down in a traffic jam while Americans rushed reinforcements forward. The difference between these 2 futures measured perhaps 6 hours, certainly no more than a day. By mid-December, as the first snow began to fall, Bastogne had become a symbol of the war's strange final phase. The Allies were winning everywhere that mattered, pushing toward the Rhine, planning the invasion of Germany itself. The town's role as a supply hub had become so routine that nobody bothered to defend it properly. The military police who directed traffic in the square outnumbered the actual combat troops stationed there. The only artillery were a few batteries passing through on their way to the front. The only armor were some tank destroyers in for maintenance. When staff officers in Paris updated their situation maps, they marked Bastogne with a white pin, meaning, rear area, no enemy contact expected. In the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, Adolf Hitler looked at his maps and saw the same town marked with a red pin, labeled Primary Objective Phase 1. The disconnect between these 2 perceptions, between the American vision of Bastogne as an insignificant logistics point and the German understanding of it as the campaign's crucial objective, would define everything that followed. It explained why the Americans would be caught so completely by surprise when the attack came. It explained why they would fight so desperately to hold what they had barely bothered to defend. And it explained why this small Belgian town, population 4,000, would see combat more intense than Normandy, more costly than Market Garden, more strategically decisive than anything except perhaps Stalingrad. The roads told the whole story, if anyone had been reading them correctly. 7 roads meant 7 directions of attack, but also 7 directions of supply, 7 routes for reinforcement, 7 ways in and 7 ways out. The Americans saw logistics, The Germans saw geometry, and geometry was about to become destiny. September 16, 1944. Adolf Hitler stood before a map table in the Wolf's Lair, his East Prussian headquarters, and drew a line with his finger that would kill 100,000 men. Generals Alfred Jodl, Wilhelm Keitel, and Field Marshals Gerd von Rundstedt and Walter Model watched in silence as their Führer traced a path from the German border through the Ardennes forests to Antwerp, splitting the Allied armies in half. The generals had seen Hitler make impossible demands before, had learned to nod and smile, and then do what was actually feasible. But this time Hitler wasn't asking, he was telling, and he was giving them fewer than 90 days to prepare the Wehrmacht's largest offensive in the West since 1940. The operation would be called Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, deliberately defensive name designed to mislead Allied intelligence into thinking the Germans were merely reinforcing their border. But Hitler's vision was apocalyptic in its ambition. 30 divisions would smash through the weakest point in the American line, cross the Meuse River, capture the port of Antwerp, and trap 4 Allied armies against the sea. With the British and Americans reeling, Hitler believed he could force a separate peace in the West and turn all his forces east to face the Soviets. It was the strategic logic of desperation, the calculation of a man who knew he was losing and had decided that the only choice was to bet everything on one last throw of the dice. The generals who heard this plan in September knew it was madness. They also knew that refusing to implement it was suicide, so they saluted and got to work. The scale of what Hitler demanded bordered on impossible. Germany was being squeezed between Soviet armies advancing from the east and Anglo-American forces closing from the west. Her cities were being bombed around the clock. Her factories were running out of raw materials. Her people were exhausted by 5 years of total war. And yet Hitler wanted 30 divisions, 1,400 tanks, 2,000 artillery pieces, and 1,500 aircraft assembled in the Ardennes by December with absolute secrecy. He wanted the 5th Panzer Army under Hasso von Manteuffel to drive the main thrust. He wanted the 6th Panzer Army under Sepp Dietrich to protect the northern flank. He wanted the 7th Army under Erich Brandenberger to shield the southern approach. Most critically, he wanted Bastogne taken in the first day. The town had to fall quickly or the entire offensive would strangle on its own logistics. Every general at that table understood this, but only Hitler seemed to think it was actually possible. The deception operation that followed showed German military competence at its most impressive and most futile. Throughout October and November, while Allied intelligence focused on the obvious threats, the Saar, the Ruhr, the Rhine crossings, the Wehrmacht assembled an entire army group in the forests east of the Ardennes. Units moved only at night, traveling without headlights on back roads. Radio silence was absolute. Orders traveled by courier only. Dummy units created false signals in defensive sectors to make the Allies think Germany was preparing to receive attacks, not launch them. Tank engines were muffled with straw. Artillery batteries were hidden under camouflage netting, so good that Allied reconnaissance flights photographed the same forests a dozen times and saw nothing. By early December, over 250,000 men sat in freezing woods less than 5 miles from American positions, and the Americans had no idea they were there. But assembling the force revealed the Wehrmacht's deeper crisis. The tanks were there, but fuel was so short that many would run dry before reaching their objectives. The men were there, but they included 16-year-old Hitler Youth conscripts and wounded veterans recalled from hospitals, mixed with SS fanatics and exhausted Eastern Front survivors. The artillery was there, but ammunition stocks would support barely a week of intensive combat. The plan called for capturing American fuel dumps to sustain the advance. In other words, the offensive would run on captured enemy supplies, a strategy that presumed success before it could achieve success. Model and von Rundstedt both told Hitler privately that the plan had fatal flaws. He ordered them to execute it anyway. The intelligence failure on the Allied side would be studied by military academies for generations as an example of institutional blindness. Ultra-intercepts, decoded German radio messages that had given the Allies an almost magical advantage for years, were misinterpreted. Analysts saw the words offensive preparations and concluded Hitler was preparing to defend the Rhine, not attack through the Ardennes. Aerial reconnaissance photographed increased rail traffic, but attributed it to normal military movements. Frontline units reported strange probe attacks and increased German activity, but these warnings drowned in the noise of 1,000 daily intelligence reports. Most critically, Allied commanders had convinced themselves that Germany was beaten. The prevailing wisdom at SHAEF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, held that the Wehrmacht could no longer conduct strategic operations. This wasn't propaganda. They genuinely believed it. They were wrong. General Model, commanding Army Group B, met with his corps commanders on December 11th in a bunker near Koblenz for the final briefing before the offensive. He spread out the maps showing approach routes, phase lines, objectives by day. The officers stared at the red arrows showing their units driving 60 miles west in 72 hours. One divisional commander asked quietly if fuel allocations were sufficient. Model admitted they were not. Another asked if the weather forecast supported the timeline. Model said the meteorologists predicted continuing overcast, necessary to keep Allied aircraft grounded. But this was Belgium in December, so predictions meant little. A third commander asked the question everyone was thinking. What happens if we don't take Bastogne on day 1? Model looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "We take it on day 2. Everyone understood what he wasn't saying. There was no day 3. The final days before the attack acquired the strange intensity of men preparing to participate in their own funeral. Soldiers wrote letters they suspected would never be sent. Officers checked their maps obsessively, memorizing terrain they would see only once, in the dark, under fire. The SS divisions in the north prepared for their spearhead role with fanatical speeches about Germanic destiny and the treachery of the Allies. The regular, Wehrmacht units in the center and south prepared with quiet professionalism, focusing on ammunition loads and tank maintenance, and the 1,000 small details that meant the difference between a good attack and a suicide mission. Nobody spoke the obvious truth. This offensive would decide whether the war ended in December 1944 or dragged into 1945. Hitler had gambled everything. He would win spectacularly or lose catastrophically. There was no middle ground. On December 14th, 2 days before the attack, General von Luttwitz, commanding the Sylvenluster Panzer Corps, gathered his officers for their final orders. His corps would lead the assault in the 5th Panzer Army sector. His primary objective, stated with crystal clarity, was Bastogne. The 2nd Panzer Division, Panzer Lehr Division, and 26th Volksgrenadier Division would converge on the town from 3 directions and take it by December 18th at the latest. Von Luttwitz had fought in Russia, France, and Poland. He had commanded successful operations against forces that outnumbered him. But as he looked at this plan, 3 divisions trying to move through forest trails in winter, assault a defended town, and keep moving west, all while maintaining supply lines through the same terrible terrain, he felt the cold certainty that this operation existed on the knife edge between brilliant and catastrophic. Everything depended on speed, everything depended on surprise, and everything depended on the Americans not realizing what was happening until it was too late. December 15th passed in strange calm. American soldiers in the Ardennes, the 99th Infantry Division, the 106th Infantry Division, the 28th Infantry Division, spent the day in routine. Some units screened movies, others held supply distributions. The weather was miserable, low clouds and intermittent snow, but it had been miserable for weeks and would be miserable for weeks more. This was the Ghost Front, where nothing happened. Behind them in Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division celebrated in Mourmelon, France, enjoying their first real rest since Market Garden. They played softball and got drunk and wrote letters home talking about maybe being back for Christmas. 5 miles away in the German forests, 250,000 men checked their weapons one last time and waited for the order to advance. The distance between these two realities measured less than an hour. By dawn on December 16th, it would measure nothing at all. December 16th, 1944, 5:30 in the morning. Private First Class Vernon Swanson sat in a foxhole near the village of Lanzerath, trying to keep his feet from freezing when the world ended. The first shell landed 50 yards behind him, with a sound like God tearing steel in half. Then another, then dozens, then hundreds. Within 90 seconds, 2,000 German artillery pieces were firing along a 60-mile front, transforming the Ardennes forests into something from medieval visions of hell. Swanson pressed himself into frozen mud at the bottom of his foxhole and tried to understand how the ground could shake this hard without splitting open. The Ghost Front had just woken up screaming. The barrage followed patterns German artillerists had perfected across 5 years of war. First came high explosive rounds to destroy positions and kill anyone caught in the open. Then came time-fused shells that burst in the treetops, showering defenders with white-hot shrapnel and wood splinters moving at bullet speed. Then came smoke rounds to blind American observers and hide German troop movements. The gunners fired for 90 minutes without pause, walking their shells forward in a creeping barrage that drove before it like a moving wall of death. American forward positions simply ceased to exist. Bunkers that had taken weeks to build disappeared in seconds. Communication, trenches collapsed, burying men alive. The telephone lines that connected frontline units to headquarters were cut in 1,000 places. When the barrage finally stopped at 7 in the morning, the sudden silence felt like another form of violence. Then the searchlights came on. German engineers had positioned dozens of searchlights behind their front lines, aiming them at low-hanging clouds that covered the Ardennes like a gray wool blanket. The reflected light created what the Germans called künstlicher Mondschein, artificial moonlight, turning the pre-dawn darkness into ghostly illumination. Through this eerie half-light came the first German infantry waves, advancing in company-strength formations through terrain they had rehearsed in terrain models for weeks. They knew exactly where American positions should be. What they didn't know was whether anyone had survived the barrage to man those positions. In many places, the answer was no. In others, the Americans were waiting with rifles and machine guns, and the killing began in earnest. The German assault hit hardest against the greenest American units, and none were greener than the 106th Infantry Division. Activated only months earlier, shipped to Europe in October, sent to the quiet Ardennes to learn combat gradually, the division suddenly found itself facing 3 veteran German divisions in the worst terrain imaginable. The 106th, 422nd, and 423rd Infantry Regiments held positions in a heavily wooded area called the Schnee Eifel, the Snow Mountain, a high ridge that jutted into German lines like a finger. It was a terrible position tactically, surrounded on 3 sides. But this was the Ghost Front, where tactics didn't matter because nothing ever happened. Now, German units were flowing around both sides of the Schnee Eifel like water around a rock, and the 2 regiments were being cut off, even as they radioed increasingly desperate requests for orders. 15 miles south, the 28th Infantry Division's 110th Regiment faced a different nightmare. The regiment, 2,500 men, was supposed to defend a 25-mile front, a task that required spreading soldiers so thin that platoons defended positions that doctrine said needed battalions. When Panzerlehr Division hit the 110th's positions at Marnock and Clerf, the Americans fought with desperate courage and were overwhelmed by simple mathematics. German tanks rolled through American positions while infantry bypassed strong points, leaving them isolated and surrounded. By mid-morning, the 110th Regiment had shattered into small groups fighting independent battles, cut off from each other and from higher command. Some groups would fight for days, others would be overrun by afternoon. All of them were being sacrificed to buy time, though most didn't know it yet. In Bastogne, 50 kilometers west of the Tsul, fighting, General Troy Middleton received the first fragmentary reports at 7:30 and tried to assemble a picture from chaos. Radio calls spoke of massive attacks but gave no clear sense of scale. Some units reported tank sounds but couldn't confirm actual armor. Others reported infantry and company strength, which sounded like local counterattacks. The phone lines to forward units kept going dead, which meant either the Germans had cut them or, more likely, the lines couldn't handle the volume of traffic. Middleton was an experienced officer who had commanded a division in World War I. He knew the difference between a probe and an offensive, but the reports coming in were fragmentary, contradictory, and unbelievable. Nobody launched major offensives through the Ardennes in winter. The terrain was impossible. The weather was impossible. Yet as the morning wore on, the reports kept coming, and they kept getting worse. By 10 in the morning, 3 things had become clear to Middleton. First, this was not a local attack. Second, German forces were advancing on axes that pointed directly at Bastogne. Third, his corps was dissolving faster than he could reinforce it. The 106th Division's 2 trapped regiments in the Schnee Eifel represented 8,000 men who would almost certainly be lost. The 28th Division's 110th Regiment was fighting to the death but could not hold its current positions. The 99th Division in the north was being driven back by what reconnaissance reported as an entire SS Panzer Corps. Middleton did the calculation every commander dreads. He was losing the equivalent of a division every 12 hours, and there were no reserves. He picked up the phone and called his superior, General Omar Bradley, and said words no general wants to say. "I think this is the big one." The true scale of the disaster would not become clear for another 48 hours, but December 16th would go down as the last time the United States Army would be strategically surprised in the European theater. Over 15,000 American soldiers became casualties that first day, killed, wounded, or captured. 2 entire regiments ceased to exist as fighting units. The roads leading west from the front filled with refugees, Belgian civilians fleeing the fighting, American supply troops evacuating depots, wounded men staggering toward aid stations, shell-shocked soldiers who had stopped being soldiers and become just frightened men trying to survive. Into this chaos poured German armor, infantry, and reconnaissance units, moving as fast as the terrible roads and worse weather would allow, racing west toward Bastogne. That evening, as darkness fell across the Ardennes, both sides assessed the day's fighting and came to opposite conclusions. The Germans saw a breakthrough. 3 of their 4 armored spearheads had penetrated American lines and were advancing almost unopposed. The surprise had been total. The weather was holding, keeping American aircraft grounded. If they could maintain this pace for 3 more days, Antwerp was achievable. History would record this as the moment Germany seized the initiative and changed the war's outcome. The Americans saw disaster, but not yet catastrophe. Yes, they had been hit hard. Yes, they had lost ground. But the Ghost Front had absorbed enormous punishment before, and it had always held. Reserves were being mobilized. Reinforcements were on the way. This looked bad, but it wasn't collapse. Not yet. Neither side had yet focused on Bastogne with the intensity the situation demanded. For the Germans, the town was an objective scheduled for capture on December 18th or 19th. Important, but not urgent. For the Americans, it was 8 Corps headquarters, certainly, but also just a rear area town 50 kilometers from the fighting. It would take another 24 hours before both sides realized that everything about this battle, the outcome of the offensive, the survival of the American position, the operational freedom of German armor, all of it hinged on 7 roads converging on one insignificant Belgian market town. The race was already underway. The armies just didn't know they were running yet. But by December 17th, as German reconnaissance units reported American truck columns moving toward Bastogne at high speed, the generals on both sides would begin to understand. Whoever controlled those roads controlled Belgium, and whoever controlled Belgium might control how the war ended. December 17th, 1944, 6 in the morning. Lieutenant Colonel Heinrich von Lauschert stood in the cupola of his command tank, watching the sun rise over Luxembourg, and calculated that Bastogne was 4 hours away. His 2nd Panzer Division had smashed through the American front the previous day, bypassed resistance at the Our River, and now sat poised for the westward dash that would take them to the Meuse River and glory. The division's reconnaissance battalion reported American supply columns clogging the roads west. Soft targets, nothing that could stop panzers. Von Lauchert checked his maps one final time, confirmed his fuel supplies, and gave the order to advance. 4 hours to Bastogne, another 12 to the Meuse. The math was simple. The execution would prove anything but. 107 miles away in Mourmelon, France, the 101st Airborne Division was experiencing the chaos that defines rapid deployment. At 8 the previous evening, the division had received alert orders: truck up, combat load, move to the Ardennes immediately. The problem was that half the division was scattered across France on leave. Some men were in Paris, others were in Reims. A few were in civilian clothes, drunk in brothels, when military police burst in shouting that their unit was leaving in 4 hours, with or without them. Tech Sergeant Donald Burgett of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment was pulled from a Parisian nightclub at midnight, given 30 minutes to report to his truck, and found himself rolling north through freezing rain in an open deuce and a half with 80 other paratroopers. None of them knew where they were going or why. The only order was Bastogne, a name that meant nothing to soldiers who had jumped into Normandy and fought through Market Garden. It would come to mean everything. The truck convoy carrying the 101st began its journey at 6 in the morning on December 18th, a snaking line of 380 vehicles stretching for miles along the roads of eastern France. 11,840 men rode in open trucks through weather that belonged in a Russian winter, not Western Europe. They had been told to bring everything they could carry, so they wore every piece of clothing they owned and stuffed pockets with ammunition. But the movement had been so rushed that many heavy weapons were left behind. The division's artillery was following in a separate convoy. Its tank destroyer battalion was somewhere else entirely. The paratroopers were moving to combat with rifles, machine guns, and whatever else they could fit in a truck. It was a race against time, but nobody had told them what would happen if they lost. The race's geometry was visible only to those watching from headquarters. On December 17th, Dwight Eisenhower and Omar Bradley met in Verdun, appropriate site for a meeting about a battle that was beginning to resemble World War I, and made the critical decision. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, SHAEF's only strategic reserves, would move immediately to the Ardennes. The 82nd would go north to Werbemont to stop the German northern spearheads. The 101st would go to Bastogne to hold the town and stop the German center. It was a gamble that presumed both divisions would arrive before German armor. If they didn't, the divisions would be destroyed piecemeal on the roads. Bradley authorized the movement anyway because the alternative was losing Belgium. While the Americans raced north, the Germans raced west, and the two forces converged on Bastogne from opposite directions like trains heading for the same crossing. Von Lauschert's 2nd Panzer Division made excellent progress early on December 17th, advancing 15 miles against scattered resistance. Then the roads turned to mud. Then the roads filled with German supply vehicles also trying to move west. Then American resistance stiffened at crossing points. By afternoon, von Lauchert's 4-hour estimate had become 8 hours, then 12. His lead elements were still 20 kilometers east of Bastogne when darkness fell. He gave orders to continue the advance through the night, but the roads were so clogged with German traffic that tanks could barely move faster than men could walk. Panzer-Lehr Division, attacking south of 2nd Panzer, faced worse problems. Its commander, Fritz Bayerlein, was a veteran of North Africa and Normandy, perhaps the best armor commander in the Wehrmacht. But even Bayerlein couldn't make his tanks fly over traffic jams. His division spent December 17th fighting the American 110th Infantry Regiment, which refused to break despite being outnumbered 5-1. The Germans took the towns of Marnock and Clerf, but they took them slowly, and slow was death in an offensive built on speed. By evening on the 17th, Panzer-Lehr was still 30 kilometers from Bastogne, burning fuel and ammunition at rates that couldn't be sustained. Bayerlein radioed his superior, General von Manteuffel, and said what no panzer commander wants to admit: "We are behind schedule." The critical decision came not from a general, but from a brigadier. William Roberts commanded Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division, a force of 700 men and 40 Sherman tanks that had been attached to 8 Corps as the Corps' only mobile reserve. On December 16th, as the German offensive began, Roberts received orders from Middleton: detach 3 task forces, send them east to delay the German advance, buy time for reinforcements to arrive. Roberts split his command into 3 groups. Team Cherry under Lieutenant Colonel Henry Cherry headed for Longville. Team O'Hara under Lieutenant Colonel James O'Hara moved to Warden. Team de Zobry under Major William de Zobry took the crossroads at Noville. These teams, 300 men and a dozen tanks each, were being sent to hold off divisions. They knew it. They went anyway. Team de Zobry reached Noville, 5 miles north of Bastogne, on the evening of December 17th. De Zobry positioned his tanks on the ridge overlooking the approach road and told his men to dig in. At first light on December 19th, they saw what was coming: the entire 2nd Panzer Division advancing in column. 400 men with 15 tanks faced 5,000 men with 70 tanks. The resulting battle lasted 5 hours. De Zobry's team destroyed 23 German tanks and killed or wounded hundreds of Germans before withdrawing to Bastogne at midday. The action cost de Zobry half his force, but it bought the 101st Airborne 5 crucial hours. Those 5 hours made the difference between the paratroopers arriving before the Germans closed the ring or arriving after. Those 5 hours decided the battle before the battle had properly begun. The 101st's lead elements rolled into Bastogne at 11 on the night of December 18th. The soldiers who climbed down from the trucks were half frozen, exhausted and disoriented. Many didn't know where they were or what they were supposed to do, but they were there, and they were combat veterans, and that was enough. Colonel Joseph Harper, commanding the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment, reported to Middleton's headquarters and asked for orders. Middleton looked at him across a map table covered with red symbols showing German units closing on Bastogne from 3 sides. "There are 3 German divisions heading straight for this town," Middleton said. "You will defend it." Harper looked at the map, at the symbols showing enemy forces that outnumbered his own by at least 3-1, and asked the question every soldier asks when given an impossible mission. What if they attack in force? Middleton's answer would become legend. "Then, Colonel, you will withdraw fighting." By midnight on December 18th, the race was entering its final phase. German forces were converging on Bastogne from the north, east, and south. American forces were flowing into the town from the west, turning around and moving east to meet them. For the next 48 hours, the roads around Bastogne would see a series of meeting engagements as American and German units stumbled into each other in villages neither side had expected to fight for. These were battles without clear front lines, without coordinated planning, just small units fighting small units for control of crossroads and hills and farmhouses. The Germans had momentum and numbers. The Americans had defensive positions and desperation. Neither side yet understood that they were fighting for the campaign's strategic center of gravity, but the commanders were beginning to suspect, and suspicion was about to become certainty. December 19th, 1944. Dawn. Major William de Sobry stood in a stone farmhouse in Noville, 5 miles northeast of Bastogne, and watched through binoculars as the German 2nd Panzer Division assembled for attack. He counted 70 tanks. He had 15. The math wasn't difficult, but math wasn't the point anymore. The point was buying time, and time was measured in hours purchased with lives. De Sobry turned to his executive officer and gave orders that would define the day. Every tank to alternate positions after firing, every anti-tank gun to hold fire until German armor reached 500 yards. Every rifleman to fix bayonets because this was going to be close quarters work. Then he looked at his watch. It was 6:30. The Germans would attack at 7. That meant his men had 30 minutes to live or prepare to keep living. Most chose to prepare. The battle for Noville began as a meeting engagement and became a slaughter. German tanks advanced in parade formation, confident that the depleted American force would withdraw at first contact. Instead, de Sobry's Shermans opened fire at point-blank range from concealed positions, destroying the lead German tanks and blocking the road with burning hulks. German infantry advanced through the smoke and ran into American paratroopers from the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment, who had moved into Noville during the night to reinforce de Sobry. What followed was 5 hours of continuous combat in fog so thick that soldiers fired at muzzle flashes and tank silhouettes. The Americans destroyed 23 German tanks and killed or wounded hundreds of grenadiers. But the Germans kept coming, feeding fresh companies into the battle, and by noon, the American position was collapsing. De Sobry gave the withdrawal order at 1 in the afternoon. His team had held Noville for nearly 20 hours, far longer than anyone had expected. But the cost was devastating. Of the 15 tanks that entered the village, 5 limped out. Of the 400 men, barely 200 reached Bastogne alive. De Sobry himself took shrapnel to the face and lost an eye. As his men pulled back down the road to Bastogne, German artillery followed them every yard, turning the withdrawal into a running fight that didn't end until they reached the town's northern edge. They had accomplished their mission. They had delayed 2nd Panzer Division for most of a day. In a battle measured in hours, that delay was priceless. It was also nearly fatal for everyone who participated. 15 miles to the east, Team Cherry was learning the same bitter lesson. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Cherry had led his task force, 30 tanks, 400 men, toward the village of Longueville on December 18th with orders to block the road from the east. What he found instead was chaos. The road was clogged with American supply vehicles fleeing west, Belgian civilians pushing carts piled with belongings, and scattered groups of infantrymen from shattered units trying to find their parent organizations. Cherry pushed through this human flood and established defensive positions outside Longueville, expecting to face German reconnaissance elements. Instead, At dawn on December 19th, he found himself between advancing elements of Panzerlehr Division coming from the south and the 2nd Panzer Division coming from the north. His force was cut off before it had fired a shot. The ambush that destroyed Team C. Cherry unfolded with mechanical efficiency. German tanks approached from 2 directions simultaneously, catching Cherry's column strung out along the road. The lead American tanks exploded under fire from German Panthers they never saw. The rear tanks tried to turn around and found the road blocked by burning vehicles. Infantry dismounted and tried to find cover in frozen fields where there was no cover. German machine guns killed them in windows. Within an hour, Team Cherry had been reduced from 30 tanks to 8, from 400 men to fewer than 150. Cherry organized the survivors for a fighting withdrawal, abandoning the burning hulks of his armored vehicles and leading his men cross-country toward Bastogne. They reached the town on December 20th, having lost more than half their strength for the privilege of delaying Panzerlehr by perhaps 6 hours. 6 hours that would matter more than anyone knew. While the detached teams bought time with their lives, the main body of the 101st Airborne Division was forming a perimeter around Bastogne in real time, making decisions on the march about which villages to defend and which roads to block. There was no grand plan, no carefully prepared defensive line. There were only officers looking at maps, calculating approach routes, and saying, put a company there, or block that crossroads, or if they come from that direction, we're screwed. The perimeter emerged organically, shaped by terrain and available forces and the pressure of German units advancing from 3 sides simultaneously. Colonel Julian Ewell's 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment seized the villages east of Bastogne, Neffe, Bizery, Mont, in a series of lightning attacks on December 19th and 20th. These weren't set-piece battles. They were sudden violent encounters between small units meeting in villages neither side had expected to fight for. At Bizory, Company C5, 01st walked into a German company from the 26th Volksgrenadier Division that had occupied the village an hour earlier. The 2 sides opened fire from 50 yards. The firefight lasted 12 minutes and left the village in American hands and the German company destroyed. At Mont, the fighting went house to house, with Americans clearing buildings using grenades and rifle fire, while German snipers picked off anyone who showed themselves in windows. By evening, the eastern approaches to Bastogne were held by Americans, but the units holding them were under strength, low on ammunition, and exhausted. To the north, Colonel Robert Sink's 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment established positions covering the roads from Noville and Foy. These were the routes 2nd Panzer Division would use if it tried to assault the town directly, which made them the most critical terrain in the entire sector. Sink positioned his battalions on high ground overlooking the approaches, sighted his machine guns to create interlocking fields of fire, and told his company commanders that withdrawal was not an option. The regiment would hold or die. There was no middle ground. On December 20th, when German reconnaissance probed the 506th's positions at Foy, they were met with such intense fire that the probe withdrew immediately. The Germans concluded that the northern sector was too strongly held for a direct assault. They were correct. What they didn't know was that Sink had barely 800 men defending positions that doctrine said required 3,000. The western sector fell to Colonel Steve Chapuis's 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment. This was initially the quietest sector because German forces were approaching from the east, but Chapuis knew that success in the east would free German units to swing south and then west, eventually encircling Bastogne from all sides. So, the 502nd dug in at villages like Champs and Rolle, positions that seemed pointless on December 19th but would become critical by Christmas. The soldiers who dug foxholes in frozen ground that week, smashing pickaxes into earth that resisted every stroke, didn't know they were preparing positions they would defend to the death. They just knew their officers had told them to dig, so they dug. By the evening of December 20th, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st Airborne Division, in the absence of the injured General Maxwell Taylor, gathered his staff and assessed the situation. The division had been in Bastogne for barely 48 hours. In that time, it had established a defensive perimeter roughly 16 miles in circumference, covering approximately 50 square miles. The perimeter included Bastogne itself and a ring of villages 4 to 5 miles from the town center, Noville to the northeast, just lost, Foy and Bizori to the east, Marville and Wardine to the southeast, and Chams to the northwest. Every approach road was blocked. Every high point was defended. On paper, it looked impressive. In reality, McAuliffe knew he was holding this ground with barely 11,000 men against German forces that intelligence estimated at 45,000. The patchwork nature of the defense was its greatest weakness and its unexpected strength. McAuliffe commanded not just the 101st Airborne, but also remnants of Combat Command B-10th Armored, survivors of other shattered units, artillery battalions that had been caught in the retreat, and various headquarters and support troops who suddenly found themselves in combat roles. The chain of command was a nightmare. Some units reported to their original commanders, others reported to whoever was nearest. Tank destroyer crews worked alongside paratroopers who had never trained with armor. Artillery forward observers coordinated fire from batteries they had never met. It was chaos. But it was functional chaos, held together by professional competence and the shared understanding that withdrawal was not an option. That evening, German observers on hills surrounding Bastogne photographed American positions and reported to their commanders. The photographs showed truck traffic continuing to flow into Bastogne from the west. The observers counted headlights and estimated several thousand more American troops had reinforced the garrison. The conclusion reached German higher command late on December 20th. Bastogne would not fall easily. It would require a coordinated assault by multiple divisions. Such an assault would take at least 24 hours to organize. The offensive's timetable, already strained by delays at the Aar River and St. Vith, was about to slip further. General von Manteuffel, commanding 5th Panzer Army, made the calculation every attacking commander dreads. He could bypass Bastogne and leave it in his rear, which risked having his supply lines cut. Or he could assault the town, which meant stopping his advance for days. He chose a middle path, seal Bastogne completely, starve it into submission, and meanwhile push the 2nd Panzer Division past the town toward the Meuse. It was a reasonable decision. It would prove catastrophically wrong. December 20th, 1944, 4 in the morning. Private John Agnew of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment woke in his foxhole outside Foy and couldn't feel his feet. This was not metaphor. His boots had frozen to his socks had frozen to his feet, and his feet had ceased sending signals that his brain recognized as sensation. He tried to wiggle his toes and felt nothing. He sat up, the movement causing snow to cascade off his shelter half, and looked around at a landscape that belonged in an Arctic expedition photograph, not Western Europe. The temperature had dropped below 0 Fahrenheit overnight. Men who had gone to sleep in wet socks woke to find their feet frozen solid. Men who hadn't gone to sleep at all because they were standing guard woke to find they couldn't wake because they were in the early stages of hypothermia. The Ardennes winter was killing Americans faster than the Germans were. The weather that descended on Bastogne in late December 1944 was the worst winter in the region in 50 years. Temperatures ranged between 0 and 20 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chill pushing effective temperatures far lower. Snow fell intermittently, accumulating to depths of 2 to 3 feet in open ground and 6 feet where it drifted against buildings and trees. But the snow was the least of it. The overcast stretched from Scotland to the Alps, a solid deck of clouds at 800 feet that grounded Allied aircraft and plunged the battlefield into perpetual gloom. Visibility rarely exceeded 50 yards. In fog, it dropped to 10. Men fought and died within sight of each other and never knew the other was there. The weather was not neutral. It was an active combatant, and it was killing both sides with democratic efficiency. Frostbite became epidemic. Medical officers at the aid stations in Bastogne treated more frostbite cases than combat wounds in the first 3 days of the siege. The symptoms followed a predictable progression. First came tingling, then numbness, then the terrible moment when a soldier looked down at his feet and saw they had turned gray-white. Mild cases meant painful recovery. Severe cases meant amputation. The worst cases meant gangrene and death. The medics did what they could, but what they could do consisted mostly of wrapping frozen extremities in blankets and hoping. There was no heated shelter. There were no warm drinks. The only medical advice worth giving was, don't fall asleep in wet socks. And by December 21st, every sock in Bastogne was wet. The infantry bore the worst of it because infantry always bear the worst of everything. Paratroopers of the 101st lived in foxholes, scraped into frozen earth, covered by shelter halves that provided concealment but no warmth. They wore every piece of clothing they owned: long underwear, wool uniform, field jacket, overcoat if they had one, and still shivered uncontrollably. The German tactic of intermittent artillery fire made it impossible to leave foxholes for more than a few minutes. Men urinated in their foxholes because stepping out for 30 seconds risked drawing mortar fire. They defecated in helmets and threw the contents away as fast as possible. Basic human dignity became a luxury no one could afford. The artillery crews suffered differently, but no less severely. Loading a howitzer required removing gloves to handle ammunition. Bare hands touching metal at 5 degrees Fahrenheit caused instant frostbite. Gunners learned to work with gloves on, which slowed their rate of fire, but kept their fingers attached. The howitzers themselves fought back. Recoil mechanisms froze. Breech blocks jammed. Shells that normally fired to 6 miles fell short to 4 because cold air was denser than the fire tables assumed. Forward observers calling in artillery learned to adjust their calculations for temperature, but this was approximate science at best. The only certainty was that every artillery round fired meant someone's fingers touched frozen metal, and frozen metal bit like a rabid animal. The German forces surrounding Bastogne suffered the same weather, but with different problems. German soldiers had better winter clothing than their American counterparts, specifically designed white camouflage suits that provided both concealment and insulation. But German logistics were already stretched beyond breaking. Ammunition came forward in ox carts because trucks were out of fuel. Hot food was a memory. German soldiers ate frozen bread and drank melted snow, and considered themselves lucky if they found a barn to sleep in. The cold killed Germans just as it killed Americans, but the Germans died where no one saw them, in forests and fields outside the perimeter, and their bodies wouldn't be found until spring. The weather's greatest strategic impact was on air operations, and here the effect was entirely one-sided. From December 17th through December 22nd, the overcast made flying almost impossible. American P-47 fighter bombers sat grounded at bases in France and Belgium, their pilots drinking coffee and watching the skies, desperate to fly. Cargo planes that could have resupplied Bastogne by air remained on their runways. Reconnaissance aircraft that could have spotted German movements and concentrations saw nothing through the soup. The Allies' overwhelming material advantage, thousands of aircraft against barely 100 serviceable German planes, meant nothing when weather kept everything grounded. The Germans moved in daylight with impunity. Tanks that would have been destroyed by aerial attack in 30 seconds instead reached their destinations intact. The Wehrmacht's offensive succeeded precisely because the weather neutralized Allied air power at the decisive moment. Inside the perimeter, the weather created tactical paralysis. Artillery observers couldn't spot targets they couldn't see. Infantry patrols sent to establish German positions stumbled through fog, fought brief chaotic engagements, and returned with information that was obsolete by the time they reported it. American commanders planning defensive operations worked from maps but could not physically see the terrain they were defending. German commanders planning attacks faced the same problem from the opposite direction. The battle became a series of point-blank encounters between units that met accidentally in the murk, fought savagely until one side withdrew, and then lost contact again. There was no battlefield overview. There was no clear picture of where friendly forces ended and enemy forces began. There was only fog, cold, and the occasional eruption of violence when opposing patrols collided. The cold attacked equipment with systematic malice. Tank engines froze overnight and refused to start at dawn. Mechanics learned to run engines every hour through the night, burning precious fuel to keep machines operational. Small arms froze. Bolt-action rifles seized up. Machine guns jammed after firing 50 rounds as cold metal contracted and expanded unpredictably. Radios failed as batteries died in the cold. The SCR-300 backpack radio that was supposed to keep infantry companies in contact with battalion headquarters became an expensive paperweight when temperatures dropped. Communication reverted to runners, men who sprinted between positions carrying written messages, hoping artillery didn't kill them in transit. Medical supplies froze and became useless. Plasma, the miracle substance that saved shock victims and kept wounded men alive until they reached surgery, froze solid in its containers. Medics tried keeping plasma inside their jackets, using body heat to keep it liquid, but this worked only until the medic had to treat someone, at which point the plasma froze immediately. Morphine syrettes froze. Bandages froze to wounds. Medics performing amputations in unheated aid stations worked with numb fingers on frozen flesh. And the miracle was that anyone survived, rather than that so many died. On December 22nd, soldiers in foxholes around Bastogne noticed something strange. The solid overcast that had hung over the Ardennes for 6 days began to show cracks. Patches of blue appeared between clouds. The wind shifted. The temperature rose slightly, though slightly meant going from 0 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Veterans who had survived other winters, Russia, North Africa, Sicily, looked at the sky and understood what was coming. The weather was about to break. When it did, the battle would transform. American aircraft would swarm the skies like angry wasps. German movements in daylight would become suicidal. The siege would enter a new phase. But first, the Americans had to survive one more day of cold, one more day of fog, one more day of German attacks launched by forces they couldn't see until they were within rifle range. The weather was about to turn from enemy to ally, but it would kill a few hundred more men first. December 21st, 1944, 8 in the morning. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe stood in the basement of the Heinz barracks in central Bastogne, studying a map that showed his position with brutal clarity. Red pins marked German units visible from the perimeter, 7 divisions now, by intelligence estimates. Blue pins marked American positions around the circle. The distances between blue and red were shrinking. McAuliffe measured the gaps with his thumb and did simple arithmetic. The northern road, cut. The eastern roads, cut. The southern approaches, under German observation, effectively cut. That left only the road west to Neufchâteau, and reports indicated German reconnaissance had already reached the woods south of that road. McAuliffe looked at his staff officers and said what they already knew. "Gentlemen, we are surrounded." Then he smiled, which was either confidence or madness. His staff chose to interpret it as confidence. The encirclement of Bastogne happened simultaneously from multiple directions, the result of 7 German divisions converging on the town according to plans made weeks earlier. But the actual moment when the circle closed was mundane. There was no dramatic battle. There was no heroic last stand. There was simply a German motorcycle reconnaissance team reaching the road west of Bastogne at 9 on the morning of December 21st, stopping, looking west toward American supply trucks still trying to reach the town, and radioing back, "Road cut, Bastogne isolated." Within an hour, every German corps commander in the sector knew the news. Within 2 hours, German artillery observers had climbed to high points around Bastogne and begun directing fire into the town itself. The siege had begun. The last American convoy to reach Bastogne fought its way through during the night of December 19th to 20th. 70 trucks from the 4th Armored Division, carrying ammunition, medical supplies, and fuel, made a desperate run through sporadic German fire, losing 8 vehicles to ambush but getting 62 through. The drivers who made that run described driving through darkness lit only by burning vehicles, Germans firing from both sides of the road, and the absolute certainty that if they stopped, they would die. Some trucks arrived in Bastogne with German bullet holes stitched across their cabs, but their drivers uninjured. Others arrived with wounded drivers steering with one hand while holding pressure on wounds with the other. A few trucks arrived with dead drivers, kept moving by assistant drivers who climbed over corpses to reach the steering wheel. None of this was heroism in the dramatic sense. It was professionals doing their jobs under conditions that would have broken amateurs. Once the circle closed, the psychological situation changed fundamentally. For 3 days, Bastogne had been a town under threat. Now it was a fortress under siege, and fortresses had a specific military history that everyone with any historical knowledge understood. Fortresses either held until relieved or surrendered when supplies ran out. There was no third option. The Germans knew this. The Americans knew this. And both sides knew that in modern warfare, fortresses usually surrendered. The defense of Bastogne was entering its most dangerous phase. Not because German attacks were intensifying, they weren't yet, but because the psychological pressure of encirclement could do what artillery couldn't, break American morale. The German forces that completed the encirclement were a mixture of elite units and exhausted formations scraped together from across the eastern and western fronts. The 2nd Panzer Division, which had led the initial assault, had pushed past Bastogne toward the Meuse and left only screening forces to maintain the siege. Panzerlehr Division held positions south and southeast of the town. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division, a formation built from sailors, Air Force ground crew, and recovered wounded, held the east. The Führer Begleit Brigade, Hitler's escort brigade, one of the few remaining pure SS formations in the west, held the north. These units surrounded Bastogne not in a solid ring, but in a series of strong points covering the approach roads. Between the strong points were gaps, sometimes gaps of a mile or more, through which soldiers on both sides sent patrols, infiltration teams, and supply runners. Inside the perimeter, McAuliffe organized his garrison with the systematic efficiency of a professional who understood that organization mattered more than heroics. He divided the defensive sectors among his regimental commanders, giving each a specific piece of the perimeter to hold. The 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment held the east. The 506th held the north. The 502nd held the northwest. The 327th Glider Infantry held the west. Artillery battalions were positioned in central Bastogne, where they could support any sector. The remaining tanks from Combat Command B were held as a mobile reserve to counterattack any German breakthrough. It was textbook defensive doctrine, except that textbook doctrine assumed defenders had adequate supplies, air support, and reasonable expectation of relief. Bastogne had none of these. The civilian population complicated everything. Approximately 2,000 Belgian civilians remained in Bastogne when the siege began. They had nowhere to go. The roads out were cut. Their homes were in the path of artillery fire. The town's cellars, deep stone basements, that had survived centuries of European warfare, became shelters for civilians and command posts for the military simultaneously. In some cases, American battalion headquarters operated from one end of a cellar, while Belgian families huddled in the other, separated by a hanging blanket. The soldiers tried to share rations with civilians, which strained supplies that were already inadequate. Officers tried to evacuate civilians when opportunities arose, but opportunities were rare, and usually resulted in civilians being shot by Germans or Americans who couldn't distinguish fleeing civilians from German infiltrators. On the evening of December the 21st, American patrols probed in all directions to test the strength of the German encirclement. Every patrol reported the same thing. German positions in all directions, German patrols encountered at ranges of less than 100 yards, German artillery adjusting fire onto American positions with accuracy that suggested excellent. Observation. One patrol from the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment pushed east toward Neffe, encountered a German company, fought a 20-minute battle at close range, and withdrew having learned nothing except that the Germans were there in strength. Another patrol from the 506th pushed north toward Foy, ran into German machine gun positions, lost 3 men killed, and returned with the same news. By midnight, every American soldier in Bastogne understood their situation. They were surrounded by forces that outnumbered them 3 or 4 to 1. They had limited ammunition, no air support, and no clear idea when or if relief would arrive. The German commanders surrounding Bastogne assessed the situation with professional detachment. They had isolated a significant American force. Intelligence estimated 12 to 15,000 men, which was surprisingly accurate, but they had done so at the cost of stopping their offensive. The 2nd Panzer Division was still driving west, but Panzerlehr, the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, and other units were now tied down besieging Bastogne instead of exploiting the breakthrough. General von Luttwitz, commanding the 47th Panzer Corps, faced the calculation that every attacking commander faces when an objective proves harder than expected: commit more forces and take the objective, or bypass it and accept the risk. Von Luttwitz chose a middle path. He would demand American surrender. If the Americans refused, he would assault the town with overwhelming force, but he would give them the chance to surrender first. It was a humanitarian gesture, or perhaps just good tactics. Either way, it would produce the most famous single-word response in American military history. The psychology of encirclement affects different people differently. Some soldiers found clarity in the situation. Surrounded meant no retreat, which meant the choice was simplified to fight or die. Others found terror in Mistsar. The same calculation. Surrounded meant no resupply, no reinforcement, no escape. Veterans who had fought in Normandy and Holland found the situation familiar in the sense that paratroopers were always surrounded when they landed. That was the point of airborne operations. But those surrounded paratroopers had always known that ground forces were fighting their way forward to link up. In Bastogne, there was no certainty that anyone was coming. There was only McAuliffe's repeated assurance that the Third Army was on its way, and even McAuliffe didn't know where Patton's forces actually were, or how long they would take to arrive. December 21st ended with both sides making plans for December 22nd. The Germans planned to deliver a surrender ultimatum and, if that failed, to launch coordinated attacks against multiple points on the perimeter to identify weak spots. The Americans planned to hold, conserve ammunition, and hope the weather broke so aircraft could resupply them. Neither side knew that December 22nd would become the day when the battle transformed from a tactical problem into a symbol. Neither side knew that a single word, delivered by a general who didn't care much for military formality, would define the battle more than any tactical decision. The circle was closed. The Americans were trapped. But trapped armies have two choices: surrender or fight. And everyone in Bastogne, from McAuliffe down to the newest replacement, had already made that choice. They just hadn't told the Germans yet. December 22nd, 1944. 11:30 in the morning. 4 German officers walked toward American lines south of Bastogne, carrying a white flag improvised from a bedsheet tied to a rifle. They moved slowly through the snow, hands visible, expecting at any moment to be shot by nervous American sentries who might not recognize a truce flag or might not care. Lieutenant Leslie Smith of F Company, 327th, Glider Infantry Regiment, watched them approach through binoculars and couldn't believe what he was seeing. The Germans wanted to parley. In the middle of a battle, Smith sent a runner to fetch his company commander while ordering his men to hold fire. The runner returned 15 minutes later with Captain James Adams, who took one look at the approaching Germans and muttered a single word that would prove prophetic: surrender. The German delegation consisted of 2 officers and 2 enlisted men, all immaculately dressed despite 6 days of combat. The senior officer was a major whose name was recorded as Hellman, though records later proved unclear on exact identity. He carried a typed document in a leather portfolio, protected from the snow as if it were something precious. Through an interpreter, he requested to be taken to the American commander. Captain Adams, following protocol for a flag of truce, blindfolded both officers and led them to his battalion command post in a farmhouse half a mile west. The enlisted men were left at the front line, standing in the snow, wondering if they would be shot as spies. They would not be, but their message would be rejected in terms so shocking that German officers would spend days trying to explain it to their superiors. The document the German major carried was 2 pages of typed German text, formatted with the formal precision that Wehrmacht staff officers brought to all official communications. The American interpreter, a private named Ernest Premitz, who had grown up speaking German in Milwaukee, translated it aloud while Colonel Joseph Harper, commanding the 327th Glider Infantry, listened with increasing incredulity. The ultimatum began. To the USA, commander of the encircled town of Bastogne, the fortune of war is changing. This time, the USA forces in and near Bastogne have been encircled by strong German armored units. It went on to note that American supply lines were cut, that further resistance was pointless, that in the interest of saving civilian lives, the Germans offered one possibility to save the encircled USA troops from total annihilation. That possibility was surrender within 2 hours. Harper read the ultimatum twice, then checked his watch. It was noon. The Germans were giving him until 2 in the afternoon to convince his entire chain of command to surrender. The absurdity of the timeline alone would have been insulting under other circumstances. But what struck Harper more than the deadline was the tone, pompous, certain, as if German victory were already accomplished, and American surrender merely a formality. He told the German officers to wait, put them under guard in a separate room, and drove to McAuliffe's headquarters in central Bastogne. The drive took 12 minutes through streets being intermittently shelled by German artillery. Harper arrived at the Heinz barracks, descended to the basement command post, and found McAuliffe sleeping on a cot after being up most of the night, coordinating defensive preparations. McAuliffe woke with the disorientation of a man pulled from deep sleep into crisis. Harper handed him the ultimatum. McAuliffe read it once, then read it again, then looked at Harper and said, "Aw, nuts." The response was so instinctive, so perfectly captured McAuliffe's personality, that Harper later wrote it was less a decision and more a reflex. But now the question became, what to actually tell the Germans? McAuliffe had expressed his opinion, but opinions weren't formal military responses to surrender demands. The ultimatum required an answer. Harper suggested they compose something appropriately diplomatic. McAuliffe asked what they should say. Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard, the division operations officer who had been present when McAuliffe first reacted, spoke up. "What you said initially would be hard to beat, General." The final response was typed on a single sheet of paper with McAuliffe's signature at the bottom. It read, in its entirety, "To the German commander, nuts, the American commander." 22 words, one of which was the actual message. Harper took the paper, folded it carefully, and returned to the farmhouse where the German officers waited. When he arrived, he found them drinking coffee provided by American soldiers, a courtesy that said something about the strange civility that sometimes infected even the most brutal wars. Harper handed the German major the American response. The major read it, looked confused, and asked Premetz what nuts meant in this context. Premetz, who understood American slang from his Milwaukee childhood, struggled to find a German equivalent that conveyed the appropriate level of contempt. Harper, watching the German major's genuine confusion, decided to clarify. "It means, go to hell," he said through Premetz. The major's face shifted from confusion to anger to something approaching professional respect. He asked, if the American command truly understood their situation, surrounded, outnumbered, cut off from supply. Harper's response entered the historical record through multiple witnesses. "We understand our situation. Do you understand yours?" The German major clicked his heels, saluted, and asked to be escorted back to his lines. As the blindfolds were reapplied, the major said something in German that Premetz translated as, "We will kill many Americans." Harper's response, according to multiple accounts, "We'll kill many Germans." The German officers were led back through American lines at 1:30 in the afternoon, 30 minutes before their own deadline. As they walked back toward German positions, American artillery fired a single salvo that landed 100 yards behind them, close enough to make a point, far enough away to avoid hitting officers under a flag of truce. It was a gesture, a way of saying that the American response was not just verbal, but practical. The German officers reported back to General von Luttwitz at Corps headquarters and delivered McAuliffe's response verbatim. Von Luttwitz, a veteran of the Eastern Front, where Wehrmacht officers had seen German ultimatums rejected before, understood immediately. There would be no surrender. There would be an assault. And the assault would need to be massive enough to overcome defenders who had already demonstrated they would not yield to intimidation. The story of the nuts response spread through the American garrison within hours, transmitted by the same informal communication network that armies have always used to spread news faster than official channels. Soldiers who had been coldly calculating their odds of survival suddenly had something else to think about. Their commander had told the Germans to go to hell. The psychological impact was immediate and measurable. Unit commanders reported that morale, which had been grimly professional, became something approaching defiant. Men who had been conserving ammunition began requesting permission to patrol, to harass German positions, to take the fight to the enemy instead of waiting to be attacked. The nuts response transformed the siege from a defensive holding action into a declaration of intent. Bastogne would not yield. The garrison would not consider surrender. The only question was how many Germans would die learning this lesson. The German reaction was more complex. Von Luttwitz reported to his superior, General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding 5th Panzer Army, that the American commander had refused in insolent terms. Manteuffel, pragmatic and experienced, understood that this changed the operational picture. Bastogne could not be bypassed and left in the German rear if its garrison was prepared to fight indefinitely. The town had to be taken by assault, which meant committing forces needed for the drive to the Meuse. Manteuffel made his recommendation to Field Marshal Model, commanding Army Group B, pause the offensive's western spearheads, redirect sufficient forces to crush Bastogne within 48 hours, then resume the advance. Model, who had been reading increasingly pessimistic reports about fuel shortages and American reinforcements, approved the plan. The German offensive, already behind schedule, was about to lose another 2 days fighting for a town that was supposed to fall without a fight. What neither side fully understood on December 22nd was that the nuts response was making history bang in real time. The story reached American newspapers via war correspondents attached to ISI's Corps headquarters, who had evacuated west before the encirclement. By December 27th, newspapers across America carried the story on their front pages. By New Year 1945, nuts had entered American English as shorthand for defiant resistance against overwhelming odds. The response transcended its military context and became cultural artifact, the kind of moment that defines a nation's self-image. McAuliffe, who had meant it as simple expression of contempt, found himself famous in ways he never sought and never particularly wanted. But on December 22nd, as the German officers walked back to their lines and American officers prepared for the assault they knew was coming, the nuts response was not yet legend. It was simply one general's profane reaction to an ultimatum he found insulting. The question now was whether profanity could be backed by firepower. The Germans had given their answer to the American refusal. Artillery fire increased immediately after the truce delegation returned, pounding American positions with systematic intensity. The Americans had given their answer to the German ultimatum, not just nuts, but the determination to make that answer good. The next 72 hours would determine if McAuliffe's defiance was courage or suicide. The soldiers in foxholes around Bastogne, listening to the increasing tempo of German artillery, had made their choice. They would find out soon enough if their choice had been wise. December 21st, 1944, 2 in the afternoon. Lieutenant Colonel Carl Coles, Chief Supply Officer for the 101st Airborne Division, sat in a cold basement room with a clipboard and tried to calculate how many days his men could fight before they ran out of ways to fight. The mathematics were brutal in their simplicity. 11,000 men consumed a certain amount of food per day, fired a certain amount of ammunition in combat, required a certain amount of medical supplies to treat casualties. The division had arrived in Bastogne with what soldiers could carry: 3 days of K rations, basic loads of ammunition, minimal medical supplies. The last convoy through on December 19th to 20th had brought some additional material, but nowhere near enough. Coles tallied the numbers and reached a conclusion that made his stomach tighten. Under current consumption rates, the garrison would be combat ineffective in 4 days and starving in 7. He took his calculations to McAuliffe and delivered them without commentary. McAuliffe read the report, asked 2 clarifying questions, then made the only decision possible: ration everything. The ammunition situation was most critical because ammunition was what kept Germans outside the perimeter instead of inside it. The division's artillery consisted of 4 battalions of 75mm pack howitzers and 1 battalion of 105mm howitzers, 66 guns total, providing the defensive fire that made German infantry assaults suicidal. Under normal circumstances, American artillery doctrine called for unlimited defensive fire. When infantry requested artillery support, they got everything the guns could throw. But these were not normal circumstances. On December 21st, Coles calculated that the artillery had sufficient ammunition for 4 days of intensive combat. After that, the guns would be silent, and silent guns meant German tanks could drive straight into the town unopposed. McAuliffe's solution was rationing, enforced with almost draconian severity. Each artillery battalion received allocation of 10 rounds per gun per day for harassment fire and priority defensive concentrations. 10 rounds per gun per day sounded reasonable until you did the math. A single defensive concentration responding to a German company-level attack might require 5 rounds per gun. 2 such attacks per day exhausted the allocation. Everything beyond that came out of a central reserve controlled by division headquarters, released only for emergencies. Battery commanders who had spent their careers training to deliver overwhelming firepower suddenly had to treat each round like a precious object, to be fired only when certain it would kill Germans. Forward observers learned to wait until German infantry reached 500 yards before calling fire. Gunners learned to calculate exactly how many rounds would break up an attack without wasting shells on follow-up harassment. It was artillery on a starvation diet, and everyone knew what happened when the diet ran out. The small arms ammunition situation was only slightly better, which meant it was still terrible. Each rifleman in the perimeter had started the battle with 80 rounds of 30-06 ammunition, the basic load. By December 22nd, after 3 days of intermittent combat, many men were down to 40 rounds or fewer. Machine gun teams, which could fire 500 rounds per minute in sustained fire, received allocation of 200 rounds per gun per day. Grenade supplies were exhausted by December 21st, except for a central reserve of 300 grenades held at division headquarters. Bazooka rockets, essential for stopping German tanks, numbered fewer than 200 for the entire garrison. The mathematics were clear. The Americans could not sustain intensive combat for more than 2 more days without resupply. After that, soldiers would be fighting with bayonets and entrenching tools, and battles fought with bayonets ended one way. The medical situation bordered on catastrophic. The division's aid stations could handle perhaps 300 casualties under normal circumstances, with expectation that seriously wounded would be evacuated to rear hospitals within hours. But there were no rear hospitals. There was only Bastogne, and Bastogne's facilities consisted of 1 church, 1 school, and several cellars being used as surgical theaters. By December 22nd, the garrison had accumulated 652 wounded men, more than twice capacity. Surgeons performed amputations without anesthesia because the morphine had run out. They performed abdominal surgery in unheated cellars by flashlight. They performed amputations of frostbitten limbs using bone saws scavenged from a Belgian butcher shop. The plasma that prevented shock casualties from dying had frozen solid, and no amount of body heat could thaw it fast enough to be useful. The brutal hierarchy of medical triage emerged by necessity. Men with abdominal wounds or severe head trauma received morphine and were placed in a corner to die as comfortably as possible. The doctors called it expectant care, which meant we expect you to die and we're not wasting resources trying to prevent it. Men with wounds that would be survivable given proper hospital care, compound fractures, severe burns, deep lacerations, received what treatment was available, then were placed in recovery areas where they might live or might succumb to infection. Men with minor wounds, single gunshot wounds through extremities, shrapnel wounds not touching organs, were patched and sent back to their units. The doctors made these decisions without emotion, because emotion would have made the decisions impossible. Every surgeon in Bastogne knew they were practicing battlefield medicine that would have been considered malpractice in any civilian hospital. They also knew they had no choice. Food rationing began December 21st and grew progressively harsher. The standard army ration was 3 meals per day, 2 K rations and 1 hot meal. K rations were survival food, a box containing crackers, processed cheese, instant coffee, and canned meat product that soldiers swore was made from compressed sawdust and hope. They provided approximately 3,000 calories per day, barely sufficient for men doing hard physical labor in freezing weather. On December 21st, McAuliffe cut rations to 2 K rations per man per day. On December 23rd, he cut it further to 1 K ration per man per day. 1,000 calories, maybe 1,200 if you ate absolutely everything, including the inedible parts. Soldiers supplemented their rations by stealing from dead Germans, by eating frozen potatoes found in Belgian cellars, by killing and eating whatever livestock remained in the ruins of surrounding villages. It wasn't starvation yet, but it was moving in that direction. The fuel situation affected mobility and, more critically, morale. American tanks and tank destroyers running on gasoline could travel perhaps 100 miles on a full tank under normal circumstances. In combat, idling engines and short high-speed bursts consumed fuel at 3 times that rate. By December 22nd, every armored vehicle in the perimeter was below half tank. By December 24th, some were running on vapors. Tank crews learned to siphon fuel from destroyed vehicles, a dangerous practice that sometimes resulted in fuel fires, but was the only way to keep operational tanks mobile. Crews also learned to mix diesel fuel from German vehicles with their own gasoline, creating a volatile mixture that engines barely tolerated, but that was better than nothing. The mathematics were stark. When the last tank ran dry, the last mobile reserve disappeared, and German armor could penetrate the perimeter anywhere they chose. The psychological impact of the supply crisis was as damaging as the physical reality. Soldiers understood that supplies meant someone was thinking about them, that the vast American logistics machine had not forgotten them. But as December 22nd became December 23rd with no resupply, darker thoughts emerged. Had they been written off? Was the High Command content to let them die here rather than risk more troops trying to save them? Would surrender become necessary not because Germans broke the perimeter, but because Americans ran out of bullets? These questions circulated through foxholes and command posts, spoken in whispers and left unfinished because finishing them meant confronting answers no one wanted to face. Coles spent December 22nd preparing 3 documents that represented the garrison's possible futures. The first was a supply plan assuming air resupply arrived within 48 hours, how to distribute material, what priorities to establish, how to rebuild combat power. The second was a plan for continuing operations on zero resupply, how long ammunition could be stretched by pure rationing, what positions could be held if artillery went silent, where final defensive lines would be drawn. The third document, which Coles kept in a sealed envelope in his jacket pocket, was a calculation of minimum supplies required to maintain 1,000 men in prisoner of war status for 30 days. It was the document he hoped never to need. It was also the document he suspected he might need by December 26th if the weather didn't break and air resupply didn't arrive. The weather on December 22nd showed no signs of cooperation. The overcast remained solid. The temperature hovered near zero. Snow fell intermittently, not enough to create drifts, but enough to make visibility even worse. American soldiers in foxholes looked at the sky and prayed for it to clear, because clear skies meant aircraft, and aircraft meant supplies, and supplies meant living through this. The soldiers didn't know that meteorologists at SHAEF headquarters were predicting a break in the weather within 24 to 48 hours. They didn't know that supply officers were already loading C-47 cargo planes with ammunition, food, and medical supplies, waiting for the moment they could fly. They knew only what they could see: gray skies, falling snow, and the slow realization that they were living on borrowed time measured in remaining bullets. December 22nd ended with both sides preparing for what was coming. The Germans were massing forces for the Christmas assault they believed would break Bastogne's defense. The Americans were counting bullets and calculating how long they could hold when the assault came. Between these two futures stood mathematics, cold calculations of supply against consumption, firepower against numbers, time against desperation. The mathematics said the Americans would lose unless resupply arrived soon. But mathematics didn't account for stubbornness, for professional pride, for the fact that surrounded soldiers sometimes fight harder than soldiers with escape routes. The mathematics were clear. The outcome was not. And in the gap between mathematical certainty and battlefield reality, 11,000 men waited for either salvation or catastrophe, knowing that both were approaching at the same time. December 24th, 1944. Midnight. In the ruins of the Church of St. Peter in central Bastogne, Chaplain Francis Sampson stood before an altar improvised from ammunition crates and prepared to celebrate midnight mass. The church had no roof anymore. German artillery had removed it on December 21st. Snow drifted through the open rafters and settled on the pews where 200 soldiers sat in the darkness, their breath visible in the freezing air. Sampson wore his mass vestments over his army uniform and tried to remember the words of the Christmas liturgy while artillery rumbled in the distance like a profane counterpoint to the sacred ritual. When he reached the part about peace on earth, several soldiers laughed. It was not cruel laughter. It was the laughter of men who understood irony. Sampson finished the service, blessed the congregation, and sent them back to their foxholes to wait for dawn and the German attack that intelligence said was coming. The attack began at 2 a.m. on December 25th, 3 hours ahead of schedule, which suggested either poor German staff work or excellent German deception. Whatever the reason, the result was chaos. German artillery opened up with the heaviest concentration since the offensive began, pounding the northwestern sector of the perimeter where the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment held positions around the villages of Champs and Hemrul. The barrage lasted 90 minutes, and when it lifted, the 15th Panzer Grenadier Regiment, reinforced with armor from Panzerlehr Division, emerged from the darkness in company-strength waves. They hit American positions at Champs at precisely 4:15 in the morning, which meant American defenders saw them at approximately 4:14, which meant there was almost no warning before the fighting went to point-blank range. Private George Leidenheimer of Company B, 502nd PIR, was on guard duty in a foxhole 50 yards west of Champs when the German barrage lifted. He heard engines, not tank engines, which had a deeper sound, but half-tracks carrying infantry. Then he heard German voices shouting commands. Then he heard the distinctive sound of a German MG-42 machine gun opening fire, and he understood that the attack was not coming from the east where everyone expected it. It was coming from the north, into the gap between Company B and Company C, and if the Germans got through that gap, they would be in the rear of the entire northwestern defensive sector. Leidenheimer did what he was trained to do. He opened fire at muzzle flashes, emptied his M1 rifle's 8-round clip in less than 6 seconds, reloaded, and kept firing until the Germans either died or went to ground. He did not consider this heroism. He considered it staying alive. The battle for Champs became the Christmas fighting's focal point because Champs controlled the road from Hemroulet to Bastogne, and that road was the Germans' avenue into the town's center. If they took Champs, they could push armor straight down the road and split the American defense in half. The 502nd PIR understood this, which is why Companies B and C threw everything they had into holding the village. The Germans understood this equally well, which is why they kept feeding fresh companies into the assault, despite taking casualties that would normally have caused units to withdraw. What resulted was 5 hours of continuous close-quarters combat in darkness, fog, and falling snow. Conditions that turned the battle into a series of point-blank encounters between men who saw each other as dark shapes moving through gray murk. By 8 in the morning, the Germans had penetrated 1,000 yards into the American perimeter at Champs, the deepest penetration of the entire siege. German infantry occupied buildings in the village center. German armor, 3 Mark IV tanks and 2 Stu-by assault guns, had pushed down the road toward Hemroulet and were engaging American positions at ranges under 300 yards. If the Germans committed another regiment at this point, they would likely break through to Bastogne, but generals rarely see the battlefield clearly, and the German commanders at corps level received reports that their attack was succeeding, but encountering strong resistance, which was military language for, "We're taking heavy casualties but haven't broken yet." The additional regiment wasn't committed. The moment passed, and the Americans counterattacked. The American counterattack came from the last place Germans expected, the east. McAuliffe had held back a reserve force, 10 operational Sherman tanks from Combat Command B and 2 rifle companies from the 501st PIR, for exactly this purpose. When word reached division headquarters that Germans had penetrated at Champs, McAuliffe committed his reserve without hesitation. The tanks and infantry rolled west at 9 in the morning, moving through Bastogne's streets while German artillery tried to track them with counter-battery fire. They reached the outskirts of Champs by 10 o'clock and attacked immediately, hitting the German penetration from its flank and rear. The Germans, who had been focused on pushing south toward Bastogne, suddenly found American tanks firing into their formations at point-blank range while American infantry attacked German infantry from directions they had thought were secure. What followed was slaughter. The German Mark IV tanks, which had been advancing confidently down the road, found themselves engaged by Shermans from less than 50 yards. At that range, even the Sherman's inferior 75mm gun could penetrate Mark IV armor. 3 German tanks exploded within minutes. The 2 Stu-G assault guns tried to withdraw and were destroyed by American bazooka teams that had infiltrated through buildings. German infantry, which had been attacking south, now had to defend north against American paratroopers who were fighting with the fury of men who understood that this was the crisis point of the entire battle. By noon, the German attack had not just stalled, it had reversed. By 2 in the afternoon, American forces had recaptured Champs and pushed German survivors back to their start lines. The Christmas assault had failed. The cost was measured in bodies that would not be counted until spring. The 15th Panzer Grenadier Regiment, which had attacked with approximately 1,800 men, withdrew with fewer than 1,200. The 502nd PIR lost approximately 200 men killed, wounded, or missing. The village of Champs, which had been a cluster of stone buildings and a church before Christmas, was now a ruin where every building showed battle damage, and several had been destroyed completely. Belgian civilians who had sheltered in cellars emerged to find their homes gone and their neighbors dead. The Americans offered condolences and moved on, because there was no time for anything else. The Germans withdrew and regrouped because that was what professional armies did after failed assaults. And both sides prepared for what came next because everyone understood that Christmas Day had decided nothing except that Bastogne would not fall easily. While the battle raged at Champs, a different kind of Christmas was happening in other parts of the perimeter. At the aid, stationed in the church, surgeons took a 30-minute break from treating wounded to accept Christmas dinner, cold K rations eaten standing up because there was nowhere to sit. At the artillery positions, gunner crews fired their rationed ammunition in support of the Champs battle, then cleaned their guns and sang Christmas carols while waiting for new fire missions. In foxholes around the perimeter, soldiers who were not actively in combat opened the packages that the Red Cross had delivered in happier times. Small boxes containing cigarettes, candy, and letters from school children wishing them Merry Christmas. Some soldiers read these letters and cried. Others read them and laughed. A few used them to start fires because frozen fingers mattered more than sentiment. The most surreal Christmas moment came at noon, when Chaplain Sampson conducted an outdoor service in Bastogne's central square, while artillery shells fell intermittently on the town's outskirts. Approximately 500 soldiers attended, standing in formation, while Sampson delivered a sermon about faith, sacrifice, and the certainty of deliverance. He was interrupted twice by incoming artillery, once when a shell landed 3 blocks away, causing the formation to flinch but not break, and once when American counter-battery fire from the howitzer positions thundered over their heads in response. Sampson waited for the noise to subside, then continued his sermon. When he finished and pronounced the benediction, the soldiers said Amen and returned to their positions. Several would be dead before nightfall. None of them knew which several. They went anyway. German soldiers spent Christmas differently, but no less grimly. In foxholes surrounding Bastogne, German infantry ate cold rations and wondered why they were still fighting for a town that was supposed to have fallen a week ago. In command posts behind the lines, German officers received reports of the failed Christmas attack and calculated how many more men they could afford to lose before the Bastogne operation became unsustainable. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler received reports that Bastogne still held and demanded explanations why 3 divisions had failed to take a town defended by 1. The explanations, American resupply by air, unexpected defender morale, terrible weather, overextended logistics, did not satisfy him. He ordered the assaults to continue until Bastogne fell. His field commanders, who understood that this order was military insanity, prepared to obey anyway because disobeying Hitler meant execution. December 25th and ended with both sides bloodied but intact. The Germans had failed to break the American perimeter but had demonstrated they could mass forces for coordinated attacks. The Americans had held but had expended their last operational reserve doing so. The mathematics of survival that Lieutenant Colonel Coles had calculated on December 21st were now running on vapors. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. Food was down to half K rations per man per day. Medical supplies were gone except for bandages and whatever morphine could be scavenged from dead Germans. The weather showed signs of breaking. Patches of blue appeared through the overcast in the afternoon, but whether aircraft would arrive in time remained uncertain. What was certain was that Christmas 1944 in Bastogne had been unlike any Christmas in American military history. There had been no peace. There had been no goodwill. There had been only men fighting to survive in conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. Some would remember it with pride. Others would remember it with nightmares. All would remember it as the day they learned what they were capable of, when everything else was stripped away. December 23rd, 1944, 9 in the morning. Staff Sergeant John Butler of Company F, 101st Airborne Division Pathfinder Unit stood in a snow-covered field a mile west of Bastogne and looked at the sky with an intensity that bordered on religious fervor. For 6 days, the sky had been enemy territory, gray, impenetrable, keeping American aircraft grounded and German forces free to move in daylight. But this morning, for the first time since December 16th, the overcast showed cracks. Patches of blue appeared between clouds. The wind had shifted to the north, which meant high pressure moving in, which meant the weather system that had paralyzed Allied air power was finally breaking. Butler turned to his Pathfinder team. 6 men with radio equipment, colored smoke grenades, and rectangular panels in international orange, and gave the order they had been waiting a week to hear. Set up the drop zone. They're coming. The decision to attempt air resupply had been made at SHAEF headquarters on December 21st, when meteorologists predicted the weather would break within 48 to 72 hours. The whole operation would use the 9th Troop Carrier Command, the same C-47 transport squadrons that had dropped paratroopers on D-Day and Market Garden. But this would be different. D-Day drops had been at night, over controlled territory, with massive support. The Bastogne resupply would be in daylight, over a town surrounded by Germans with anti-aircraft guns, into drop zones that measured barely 400 yards across. The pilots who drew this mission knew the mathematics. C-47s cruised at 160 miles per hour at altitudes under 1,000 feet, making them perfect targets for German flak. Some aircraft would be shot down. The only question was how many. The first wave of transport aircraft, 16 C-47s from the 436th Troop Carrier Group, departed their base at Calais, France, at 10:30 on the morning of December 23rd. Each aircraft carried approximately 2 tons of supplies, ammunition, medical supplies, food, and fuel, all packed in parachute bundles that would be kicked out the cargo doors when the aircraft reached the drop zone. The pilots flew at 300 feet, barely above tree level, navigating by map and compass because radio silence was mandatory to avoid alerting German defenses. The formation crossed into Belgium at 11 o'clock and immediately encountered German flak. The lead aircraft took hits in the tail and right wing, but maintained formation. 2 aircraft in the rear of the formation peeled off with engine trouble. The remaining 14 continued toward Bastogne. Butler heard them before he saw them. The distinctive drone of radial engines, growing louder, resolving into individual aircraft. Then they appeared over the tree line, flying in tight formation at barely 400 feet, so low that soldiers on the ground could see pilots in cockpit windows. Butler ignited colored smoke grenades, orange and green, the recognition signals that told pilots they were over, the correct drop zone. Then he spread his orange panels in a large T, the international symbol for drop supplies here. The aircraft passed overhead at 11:45, and the cargo doors opened, and the sky began to rain parachutes. What followed was organized chaos. Each aircraft dropped 12 to 15 bundles, and each bundle descended on a 28-foot diameter parachute in colors that indicated contents: red for ammunition, green for rations, white for medical supplies, yellow for gasoline. 168 bundles fell in the first wave, dispersing across the drop zone in a rough pattern that looked random but followed the wind. Most landed in American-controlled territory. Some drifted into no man's land between the perimeter and German positions, setting off frantic races as both sides tried to recover the supplies. A few landed directly in German positions, giving German soldiers their first good meal in days and providing German intelligence officers with detailed information about American supply priorities. The recovery operation required every available soldier not actively in combat. Men sprinted from their foxholes, grabbed bundles, cut parachutes loose, and dragged supplies toward collection points, while German artillery adjusted fire onto the drop zone. Several men were killed recovering supplies that would save lives of others. One ammunition bundle landed on a soldier from the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment, killing him instantly, a death by friendly resupply that felt particularly cruel. But the supplies kept coming. Second wave at 1 in the afternoon, third wave at 3. By sunset on December 23rd, 241 C-47 sorties had dropped 320 tons of supplies into Bastogne. It was not enough to solve the supply crisis, but it was enough to buy time. The cost in aircraft was substantial, but not catastrophic. 19 C-47s were shot down by German anti-aircraft fire on December 23rd. Approximately 80 airmen were killed, with another 35 captured after parachuting from damaged aircraft. The Germans, who had grown accustomed to air superiority during the first week of the offensive, were shocked by the scale of the resupply effort. German anti-aircraft batteries fired thousands of rounds at the lumbering transports, but scored relatively few hits given the target-rich environment. The C-47's low altitude made them difficult targets because German gunners had to aim almost horizontally, which meant background clutter interfered with tracking. Still, the loss rate, approximately 8% of sorties, was unsustainable. If weather remained clear and resupply continued, the 9th Troop Carrier Command would lose dozens more aircraft. The command's leadership accepted this as necessary cost of keeping Bastogne supplied. December 24th brought both intensified resupply operations and the arrival of combat air support. While transport aircraft continued dropping supplies, 160 sorties on Christmas Eve, fighter bombers from the Ardennes Tactical Air Command finally entered the battle. P-47 Thunderbolts from the 358th, 362nd, and 365th Fighter Groups flew nearly 200 sorties on December 24th, attacking German armor and artillery positions surrounding Bastogne. The Thunderbolts carried bombs, rockets, and ammunition for their 850 caliber machine guns, and they used all of it with devastating effect. German tanks that had moved with impunity during the overcast suddenly found themselves destroyed by aircraft attacking from angles that made defense impossible. German supply columns were strafed. German artillery positions were bombed. German infantry formations were scattered by strafing runs that killed men before they knew they were being attacked. The psychological impact of American air superiority was as important as the physical damage. For 6 days, German forces had owned the daylight, moving freely and attacking American positions with confidence that no aircraft would interfere. Now, suddenly, every movement in daylight invited destruction. German units reverted to night movement only. German commanders learned to expect that any concentration of forces would be spotted and attacked within hours. The entire operational tempo of the German offensive slowed because daylight operations became suicidal. One German division commander, interrogated after capture, said that December 23rd marked the moment he knew the offensive had failed, because any operation that could not sustain itself in daylight could not sustain itself at all. The supplies themselves, once recovered and distributed, transformed the defensive situation. Artillery batteries that had been down to 5 rounds per gun suddenly had 50. Rifle companies that had been counting individual bullets suddenly had full basic loads. Medical stations that had been performing surgery without morphine suddenly had plasma, antibiotics, and anesthetics. The food situation improved from half K rations to full rations, plus hot coffee for the first time in 4 days. It was not abundance. The garrison would remain under supply stress throughout the siege, but it was sufficiency, and sufficiency meant the difference between holding and collapsing. The Pathfinder teams who guided the aircraft operated under conditions that tested the limits of human courage. They stood in open fields, clearly visible to German observers, marking drop zones with smoke and panels, while German artillery tried to kill them. Staff Sergeant Butler's team alone guided 93 aircraft on December 23rd and 24th. On December 24th, a German artillery round landed 5 yards from Butler's position, wounding 2 Pathfinders and destroying their radio equipment. Butler improvised new signals using smoke grenades and continued guiding aircraft, while his wounded team members treated each other's injuries. He received the Distinguished Service Cross for this action, one of the war's highest decorations for valor, and later said that he had just been doing his job. Perhaps. But his job that day was standing in a field while Germans tried to kill him, and he did it for 12 hours without break. December 25th saw reduced resupply operations because of the German ground assault on Champs, which threatened to overrun one of the drop zones. Only 96 sorties flew on Christmas Day, dropping 160 tons. But by then the crisis had passed. The garrison had sufficient ammunition to repel the Christmas assault and sufficient food to maintain operations for several more days. The weather, which had been the Germans' greatest advantage, had become the Americans' ally. Clear skies meant American aircraft ruled the battlefield. Clear skies meant German movements were observed and attacked. Clear skies meant that the siege of Bastogne had entered a new phase, where the besiegers were themselves under siege from the air. The final tally for December 23rd through December 26th told the story in numbers. 962 C-47 sorties dropped 850 tons of supplies into Bastogne. 741 fighter-bomber sorties attacked German positions. 19 transport aircraft were shot down, with approximately 80 airmen killed, but those losses enabled 11,000 American soldiers to continue fighting, which, from a cold strategic perspective, was acceptable exchange. The airmen who flew these missions understood what they were doing. They were gambling their lives to save other men's lives, flying into concentrated anti-aircraft fire because soldiers on the ground needed what they carried. Some would call this heroism. The pilots and crew chiefs called it duty. Whatever the label, it changed the battle's outcome as surely as any ground action. The sky had opened, and when it opened, salvation came in the form of olive-drab parachutes and propeller-driven transports flown by men who could have refused, but didn't. December 19th, 1944. 11 in the morning. Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr. stood in a map room in Verdun, France, facing Dwight Eisenhower and Omar Bradley, and said something that made both men pause. "I can attack north with 3 divisions in 48 hours. Bradley, who commanded 12th Army Group and knew Patton's habit of over-promising, asked for clarification. Did Patton mean 3 divisions ready to move in 48 hours, or 3 divisions actually attacking in 48 hours? Patton, who understood the difference, said, "Attacking, not moving, attacking." He pointed to the map where his Third Army was engaged in heavy fighting east of the Saar River. To disengage those forces, wheel them 90 degrees north, move them 100 miles over winter roads, and launch coordinated attacks in 48 hours would require logistical and operational competence beyond anything the Army had previously achieved. Eisenhower, who had dealt with Patton's personality for years, looked at him and asked the only question that mattered. "Can you actually do this?" Patton's answer entered the historical record. "I've already started." The movement that followed, officially designated Operation Urgent, remains studied at military schools as perhaps the finest example of operational maneuver in the European theater. Patton had anticipated the German offensive earlier than his intelligence staff had confirmed it. On December 18th, while fighting still raged in the Saar, he had ordered his staff to prepare contingency plans for disengaging 6, 12 and the 3 Corps from their current operations, moving them north and attacking into the southern shoulder of the German penetration. When Eisenhower authorized the movement on December 19, Patton's Corps commanders already had their orders. They began moving that evening. The scale of what Patton was attempting bordered on insane. 3 entire corps, 9 divisions comprising 133,178 men, 11,000 vehicles, and 62,000 tons of supplies, would disengage from offensive operations, turn 90 degrees, travel distances ranging from 60 to 120 miles, and conduct coordinated offensive operations, all within 72 hours. The movement required every road in eastern France and Luxembourg be converted to one-way traffic flowing north. It required fuel trucks driving continuously to keep vehicles moving. It required staff officers working without sleep to coordinate movements so divisions didn't collide at intersections. It required unit commanders who could make decisions without waiting for orders because orders couldn't flow fast enough to control this chaos. The 4th Armored Division, which would lead the 3 Corps' attack and ultimately break through to Bastogne, began its movement on December 21st from positions near Saarbrücken, 110 miles from Bastogne. Major General Hugh Gaffey, commanding the division, split his command into 2 combat commands that would advance on parallel routes, concentrating only when they hit serious resistance. Combat Command A, under Lieutenant Colonel Crichton Abrams, took the eastern route. Combat Command R under Colonel Wendell Blanchard took the western. Both commands rolled north through snow and freezing rain, moving as fast as road conditions and German resistance allowed. On December 22nd, they crossed into Luxembourg. By evening December 23rd, they were engaged in heavy fighting with German forces south of Bastogne. The Resistance 4th Armored Division encountered demonstrated why Patton's promised relief wasn't arriving faster. The Germans had anticipated relief attempts from the south and positioned forces accordingly. The 5th Parachute Division, veteran troops with morale still largely intact, held positions across 4th Armored's approach routes. These were not rear area security troops. These were combat formations with anti-tank guns, extensive minefields, and orders to hold at all costs. The fighting from December 22nd through December 26th was continuous and brutal, a series of meeting engagements and deliberate attacks against prepared positions in terrain that favored defenders. The village of Martelange, 9 miles south of Bastogne, became the first major obstacle. German paratroopers had blown the bridge over the Saar River and positioned anti-tank guns covering the crossing site. Combat Command R reached Martelange on December 23rd and spent 18 hours trying to force a crossing. Engineers built a Bailey Bridge under fire. Infantry crossed in assault boats and established a bridgehead. Armor crossed, and was immediately engaged by German anti-tank guns positioned in buildings. The village was taken and retaken 3 times. By December 24th, American forces held Martelange, but they had lost 23 tanks, 16 other vehicles, and approximately 400 men. 9 miles had cost them nearly a full battalion. 17 miles remained to Bastogne. The next obstacle was Chaumont, 5 miles north of Martelange. Here, Combat Command B under Colonel Blanchard ran into elements of Panzer-Lehr Division that had been pulled back from the Bastogne siege to block relief attempts. The German forces included Mark IV tanks and Stu-G assault guns, armor roughly equivalent to American Shermans, but positioned defensively, which gave them tactical advantage. The battle for Chaumont on December 24th became a tank duel at ranges under 500 yards, with neither side achieving clear advantage. American artillery finally broke the stalemate, pounding German positions with concentrated fire that forced withdrawal, but the delay cost another 12 hours. Patton's promised relief, which was supposed to reach Bastogne by Christmas Eve, was running a full day behind schedule. Christmas Day brought Patton's forces to within 5 miles of Bastogne and complete frustration. German forces, now a mixture of Panzer-Lehr, 5th Parachute Division, and elements of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, had established defensive positions in depth. Every approach route was mined, every hill was defended, every village was a strong point. 4th Armored Division attacked continuously on December 25th and advanced barely 2 miles. The casualties were mounting, over 1,400 men since beginning the relief effort, with 82 tanks destroyed or disabled. Patton, monitoring progress from his headquarters, grew increasingly frustrated. He had promised Eisenhower he would relieve Bastogne by Christmas. It was now December 25th, and his forces were still 5 miles away. The breakthrough, when it came, resulted from tactical audacity rather than operational brilliance. On December 26th, Combat Command ER identified a gap in German positions between the villages of Assenois and Clochimont. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion, proposed a direct thrust through this gap. 40 tanks racing up the road to Bastogne at maximum speed, bypassing German strong points, accepting risk of being cut off in exchange for speed. Gaffey approved the plan. Abrams briefed his officers at 10 in the morning. At 1:30 in the afternoon, his battalion moved out. The thrust from Assenois to Bastogne covered 3 miles in 90 minutes. Abrams's tanks drove at speeds exceeding 20 miles per hour, dangerously fast for armored vehicles on icy roads, but necessary to maintain momentum. German forces along the route engaged the column with anti-tank fire. 3 Shermans were knocked out. The column kept moving. German infantry with Panzerfausts, handheld anti-tank rockets, destroyed 2 more tanks. The column kept moving. At 4:45 in the afternoon, Lieutenant Charles Boggess, commanding the lead tank, crested a hill and saw American foxholes ahead. He transmitted on the radio, "Come on in, this is the 4F4, the code sign for 4th Armored Division." From the foxholes, soldiers of the 326th Engineers waved. The siege was broken. The initial corridor that opened on December 26th was barely 300 yards wide, a thin connection through German-held territory that could be cut again at any moment. The first vehicles through were tanks, followed by half-tracks carrying infantry, followed by trucks carrying supplies and medical evacuation teams. By midnight, December 26th, 40 trucks had reached Bastogne, carrying ammunition and food. Ambulances began evacuating the most seriously wounded. The corridor remained under German artillery fire. Germans on both sides could see traffic and directed fire accordingly, but it was open. Reinforcements could flow in, casualties could flow out. The siege's first phase was over. Patton's relief of Bastogne was both triumph and frustration. He had moved 3 corps 90 degrees in 72 hours, a logistical achievement studied at military academies to this day. He had attacked through terrible weather and determined opposition. He had broken through when many thought relief impossible. But he had also taken longer than promised, 72 hours instead of 48, and his forces had suffered heavily. 4th Armored Division alone lost over 2,000 casualties and 133 tanks in the relief operation. The other divisions in 3 Corps had suffered proportionally. Patton's aggressive operational style had saved Bastogne, but it had cost a price. He privately admitted was higher than anticipated. the strategic implications would take days to become clear. The relief of Bastogne meant German forces could no longer bypass the town and had to commit forces to reducing it or withdrawing. It meant American forces now held a solid anchor on the southern shoulder of the German penetration. It meant the German offensive, which had been designed to reach the Meuse River by December 20th, was now stalled completely by December 27th. Most importantly, it meant Hitler's last strategic reserve had been expended without achieving its objectives. Germany would remain on the defensive for the rest of the war. The Third Reich had 3 months and 2 weeks remaining. Bastogne had not killed it, but Bastogne had ensured it could not save itself. And in the calculus of total war, that meant the same thing. December 27th, 1944. Dawn. Captain James O'Hara of Combat Command B, 4th Armored Division, stood on the southern edge of Bastogne and watched German artillery rounds bracket the corridor that was supposed to save the town. The shells landed with mathematical precision, 200 yards south of the road, then 100 yards south, then 50 yards, walking closer with each salvo as German forward observers adjusted fire. The corridor that Lieutenant Bogis had opened the previous afternoon was barely 300 yards wide, a thin line of American-controlled territory through German positions that surrounded it on 3 sides. Every vehicle that drove up that road did so under observed artillery fire. Every soldier who walked it risked being killed by shells fired by gunners he would never see. O'Hara had been ordered to widen the corridor, to push German forces back far enough that supply trucks could drive through without being destroyed. He looked at his maps, at the terrain, at the forces he had available, and understood that this would cost lives measured in dozens. He gave the orders anyway because giving orders that cost lives was what officers did in war. The German response to Bastogne's relief was immediate and predictable: counterattack the corridor, cut it again, re-isolate the garrison. On December 27th at 6 in the morning, elements of the 5th Parachute Division hit both sides of the corridor simultaneously in company-strength attacks designed to sever the connection. The attacks came from the east, hitting American positions around Assenois, and from the west, hitting positions near Clermont. The Americans defending these villages, infantry from the 87th Division and armor from 4th Armored Division, had been fighting continuously since December 26th. They were exhausted, under strength, and positioned in terrain they had barely had time to reconnoiter. But they held because the alternative was watching the corridor collapse and Bastogne be re-isolated. The fighting along the corridor from December 27 through December 31 was as intense as anything during the siege itself, but it received less historical attention because it happened outside the Bastogne perimeter and involved units that were not surrounded. This obscures the reality. More Americans died widening the corridor than died defending the original perimeter. The 87th Infantry Division, which entered the line on December 27th, lost over 800 casualties in 3 days. The 4th Armored Division lost another 600. The Germans lost comparable numbers. The corridor that measured 300 yards on December 26th measured a mile by December 28th, 2 miles by December 29th, 3 miles by December 31st. Each 100 yards cost approximately 20 lives. The math was simple. The cost was terrible. Engineering the corridor's expansion required more than combat. Engineers had to clear roads cratered by artillery, rebuild bridges destroyed by retreating Germans, breach minefields that defenders had laid in depth. The work proceeded under fire because German artillery had the corridor registered and fired on any visible activity. Engineers learned to work at night, using minimal light, knowing that any illumination would draw fire. They filled craters with rubble and gravel, shoveled by hand. They built Bailey bridges while German machine guns fired at them from 500 yards. They probed for mines with bayonets because the division's mine detectors had been lost in earlier fighting. 3 engineers died clearing the road from Assenois to Bastogne. Their names are on casualty lists, but not in most histories of the battle. They died making logistics possible, which is less dramatic than dying in firefights, but equally necessary. The supply situation inside Bastogne improved dramatically once the corridor opened. Trucks that had been unable to reach the town for 7 days suddenly delivered ammunition, food, fuel, and medical supplies in quantities that transformed defensive calculations. Artillery battalions went from 10 rounds per gun per day to unlimited defensive fire. Rifle companies went from counting individual bullets to full basic loads with reserve. Medical stations went from amputating without anesthesia to performing surgery with proper supplies. The garrison's combat effectiveness, which had been degrading steadily since December 20th, stabilized and began to recover, but the corridor remained vulnerable, and everyone knew that German attacks could cut it again at any time. December 28th brought the first wounded evacuations. Ambulances drove down the corridor from Bastogne carrying men who had been awaiting evacuation for up to 8 days. Some of these wounded should have been evacuated immediately after injury, compound fractures, severe burns, abdominal wounds, but had remained in Bastogne because there was no way out. By the time they reached hospitals, some had developed infections that required aggressive treatment. Others had suffered complications that longer transport times would have prevented. A few died in the ambulances despite reaching medical care, victims not of German fire, but of the logistical reality that surrounded garrisons cannot evacuate casualties. The medical officers who triaged these men as they boarded ambulances made no record of who might have survived if evacuation had been available sooner. Such calculations served no purpose and provided no comfort. The Germans made their most serious attempt to recut the corridor on December 29th. At 2 in the afternoon, elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division, the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, the most elite formation remaining in the west, attacked from the east toward the village of Cibry, 3 miles west of Bastogne. This was not a spoiling attack or a probe. This was a deliberate assault with armor support, intended to drive through American positions and physically cut the corridor. The attack hit positions held by the 35th Infantry Division, which had just entered the line that morning. The fighting lasted 6 hours, with German tanks advancing to within 800 yards of the corridor road before American artillery and air support stopped them. The 35th Division lost 320 men. The Germans lost approximately 500, including 2 company commanders. The corridor held, but barely. By December 31st, the strategic situation had fundamentally changed. The corridor had been widened to 3 miles, making it militarily secure against anything short of another major German offensive. Bastogne had transformed from besieged fortress to active operational base. The 101st Airborne Division, instead of defending desperately, was preparing to attack north to push German forces away from the town. Third Army units were flowing through Bastogne toward the German lines. The siege, in military terms, was over, but the fighting was not. The Germans still held strong positions north and east of the town. They still had forces capable of local attacks, and they still received orders from higher command to retake Bastogne at all costs. Orders that would result in another 2 weeks of bitter combat. The corridor's opening fundamentally altered German strategic calculations. General von Manteuffel, commanding 5th Panzer Army, understood by December the 29th that Bastogne could not be taken without committing forces he no longer had. The 2nd Panzer Division, which had bypassed Bastogne to drive for the Meuse, had been stopped at Selles and was now retreating. The Panzer Lehr Division was so depleted that it was combat ineffective. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division had taken catastrophic casualties trying to storm American positions. Manteuffel recommended to Field Marshal Maudy that German forces withdraw from Bastogne, consolidate defensive positions, and focus on holding what they had gained. Model forwarded this recommendation to Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the German High Command, with his endorsement. Hitler rejected it. The battle would continue. The civilians who had remained in Bastogne throughout the siege experienced the corridor's opening as both relief and renewed terror. Relief because food supplies improved, because wounded could be evacuated, because the sense of complete isolation lifted. Terror because the fighting, which had been bad enough, now intensified as Germans attacked to close the corridor and Americans fought to keep it open. The artillery fire into Bastogne, which had been intermittent during the siege, became constant as Germans tried to disrupt supply traffic. Belgian civilians who had survived the siege in cellars now faced the possibility of dying from increased artillery just as relief seemed to be arriving. Approximately 63 Belgian civilians were killed in Bastogne between December 27th and January 4th, more than died during the siege itself. Their deaths were not strategic. They were incidental. But they were also inevitable, the cost of turning a town into a battlefield. The final assessment of the corridor's cost came in late January when casualty figures were compiled. American forces had lost approximately 5,000 men killed, wounded, and missing, opening and defending the corridor, more than the garrison lost during the siege. German casualties in the same operations totaled between 7,000 and 8,000. The villages along the corridor, Assenois, Clochimont, Cibray, Villerue, were ruins. The roads were lined with destroyed vehicles and unmarked graves. The corridor represented operational success, but tactical brutality. A campaign within a campaign that achieved its objectives at costs that would have been considered unacceptable under other circumstances. But these were not other circumstances. This was December 1944 in the Ardennes, and unacceptable costs had become the price of doing business. The corridor held. That was all that mattered. That, and the thousands of men who died making sure it held. December 30th, 1944, 7 in the morning. Colonel Julian Ewell, commanding the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment, briefed his battalion commanders on the most paradoxical military transition, from besieged defenders to offensive spearhead. His regiment, which had defended the eastern sector of the Bastogne perimeter for 11 days, had received orders to attack north and recapture the villages of Foy and Noville, the same villages American forces had fought for and lost during the siege's opening days. Ewell looked at his officers, most of whom had not slept more than 4 hours in any 24-hour period since December 18th, and delivered the situation with characteristic bluntness. We're attacking uphill in winter against prepared positions, held by Germans who know we're coming. It's going to be terrible. We're doing it anyway because those villages give them observation on our supply routes. Questions? There were no questions. There were never questions when the mission was suicide in all but name. The operational logic behind the counteroffensive was sound, even if the tactical execution would be brutal. German forces holding villages north of Bastogne, specifically Foy, Noville, Borcy, and Rechamps, occupied high ground that gave them direct observation over American supply routes and assembly areas. German artillery forward observers in these villages could direct fire with precision, which meant American forces couldn't mass for operations without accepting heavy casualties. The villages had to be taken, but taking them meant attacking uphill through snow and frozen fields against defenders who had spent weeks fortifying positions. The 101st Airborne Division, despite its legendary reputation, was not an assault infantry division. It was airborne, designed for rapid deployment and defensive operations. Sending it to conduct deliberate attacks against prepared positions was tactical desperation, dressed as operational necessity. The attack on Foy began January 3rd at 6 in the morning with an artillery preparation that expended more shells in 30 minutes than the entire Bastogne garrison had fired in the previous week. Every available howitzer pounded German positions while American infantry moved into assault positions in darkness. At 6:30, the barrage lifted, and 2 battalions of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment advanced across open ground toward Foy. The Germans waited until American infantry reached 200 yards, then opened fire with machine guns and mortars that had been pre-registered on the approach routes. The American first wave took 50% casualties before reaching the village outskirts. The second wave took 40%. By noon, American forces held half of Foy. By evening, they held all of it. The cost was 318 casualties in the 506th alone, nearly a third of the regiment's remaining strength. Noville, 5 miles northeast of Bastogne, presented an even worse tactical problem. The village sat on high ground with clear fields of fire in all directions. The Germans had fortified every building and dug extensive trench systems connecting strong points. An intelligence assessment estimated German strength at battalion level, 600 to 800 men with armor support. American strength committed to the attack was 2 battalions, approximately 1,200 men, but many of these were replacements who had joined their units in the past week and had never been in combat. The attack launched January 9 and immediately stalled against German defensive fire. American infantry advanced 50 yards and went to ground. Artillery was called in. The artillery lifted. Infantry's advanced another 30 yards. Machine gun fire stopped them again. This cycle repeated for 6 hours. By evening January 9th, American forces had advanced 300 yards and taken 200 casualties. Noville remained in German hands. The battle for Noville became a test of will rather than tactical competence. American commanders understood they were taking unsustainable casualties, assaulting a position that had limited strategic value. German commanders understood they were expending irreplaceable men defending a village they would eventually have to abandon anyway. But both sides continued because military operations acquire momentum independent of rational calculation. The battle became about not losing rather than winning. American prestige demanded Nouville be taken. German pride demanded it be held. And soldiers on both sides died advancing these abstract nouns. Nouville finally fell January 15, after a week of continuous combat. American casualties for the village alone totaled 470 men. German casualties were estimated at 600. The village itself had been obliterated. There was nothing left but rubble and bodies. The physical conditions during the counteroffensive made every operation harder than combat doctrine suggested. Temperatures averaged -10 Fahrenheit, with wind chill pushing effective temperatures to -30. Infantry attacking across open ground moved through snow 2 feet deep. Every step required effort. Every 100 yards produced exhaustion. Men who fell from wounds sometimes froze to death before medics could reach them, bleeding out in snow that turned red and then black as blood froze. Frostbite casualties exceeded combat casualties some days. Companies attacked at dawn with 120 men and reached objectives at dusk with 60, half the losses from enemy fire and half from cold. Medical officers performing triage in forward aid stations saw injuries they had only read about in U. Medical school, frostbite so severe that entire limbs had turned black. Hypothermia cases where core body temperature had dropped so low that standard rewarming procedures didn't work. Trench foot infections that required amputations because the tissue was already dead. The tactical innovation that emerged from this grinding attrition was combined arms coordination beyond anything doctrine specified. Infantry learned to work with tanks at ranges under 50 yards, using armor as mobile cover. Tank crews learned to suppress German positions, while infantry maneuvered rather than trying to kill everything themselves. Artillery forward observers learned to walk fire directly onto German positions, while American infantry was within 100 yards, accepting risk of short rounds because the alternative was watching infantry get cut down in open ground. These techniques weren't taught at Fort Benning or West Point. They were improvised by small unit leaders trying to accomplish impossible missions with inadequate resources against determined opposition. Some worked, some didn't. The failures cost lives. The successes saved lives. And slowly, yard by yard, the villages north of Bastogne fell to American forces. The German defense of these villages demonstrated tactical competence even in defeat. German commanders positioned forces in depth, ensuring that even if Americans took one strong point, they would immediately face fire from supporting positions. German artillery fired with precision, despite Allied air superiority, using forward observers hidden in cellars and church steeples. German infantry conducted counterattacks at company level, not to retake lost ground, but to inflict casualties and slow American advances. By mid-January, German tactical doctrine had evolved into fighting withdrawal, hold as long as possible, inflict maximum casualties, withdraw to next prepared position, repeat. It was the doctrine of a defeated army, but it was effective at turning Allied victories expensive. The cost of the counteroffensive horrified division commanders who had celebrated surviving the siege. The 101st Airborne Division had lost 1,641 casualties during the siege proper, December 20th through 26th. In the counteroffensive from December 30th through January 17th, it lost an additional 1,641 casualties, exactly the same number, pure coincidence that felt like cosmic irony. The division that landed in Bastogne on December 18th with 11,840 men, was withdrawn on January 17th with fewer than 7,000 effective. It had taken 33% casualties in 4 weeks, a rate that exceeded Normandy, exceeded Market Garden, exceeded anything the division had previously experienced. The human cost of pushing German forces away from Bastogne had equaled the cost of defending it. Individual soldiers experienced the counteroffensive as a blur of cold, exhaustion, and violence, punctuated by moments when they were too tired to care if they lived or died. Private Webster of Easy Company, 506th PIR, wrote in a letter dated January 12 that he had stopped thinking about survival and started thinking only about completing the immediate task. Get to that tree line, clear that building, reach that road junction. Tomorrow was abstract. Next week was incomprehensible. The mission was everything, because the mission was finite and survival was not. Many soldiers reported similar psychological compression, where time ceased having meaning beyond the immediate moment. This was not PTSD, though that would come later. This was functional adaptation, the human mind's way of processing situations that exceeded its capacity for rational comprehension. By January 17th, when the 101st Airborne was finally withdrawn from the line and sent to France for reconstitution, the Bastogne perimeter had expanded to include all the villages Germans had held in late December. Foy, Noville, Borcy, Rachamps, all were in American hands. The high ground that had given Germans observation over Bastogne was now American-controlled. The town itself was secure enough that supply operations proceeded without artillery interference. In military terms, the Bastogne operation was complete. The town had been held, the corridor had been defended, the counteroffensive had succeeded, but success felt hollow to soldiers who had watched half their company die taking villages they couldn't even pronounce, fighting for terrain whose strategic value they didn't understand and weren't sure existed. The final morning in Bastogne, January 17th, passed without ceremony. Trucks arrived to evacuate the 101st. Soldiers climbed aboard with the mechanical movements of men too exhausted for emotion. Some looked back at the town where they had fought for a month. Others looked forward, toward France and rest. A few were so tired they fell asleep before the trucks moved. The drive to Mourmelon took 6 hours. Most soldiers slept the entire way. When they arrived at their barracks, officers gave them 3 days of unrestricted leave and orders not to discuss the battle with anyone. The men took the leave, ignored the orders, and spent the next month trying to explain what had happened in ways that made sense to people who hadn't been there. Most gave up trying. Bastogne became something they carried privately, a shared experience that could not be transmitted, only endured. And later, when Hollywood made movies and historians wrote books and the battle became legend, veterans would watch and read and think, that's not how it was. But they wouldn't say it aloud because saying it aloud meant explaining, and explaining was impossible. So they stayed silent and remembered, and the silence was its own kind of casualty. January 20th, 1945, 8 in the morning. Captain John Pryor of the Graves Registration Service stood in a frozen field outside Foy and supervised the exhumation of bodies that had been temporarily buried during the fighting. His team, 12 enlisted men with shovels and body bags, worked methodically through snow and frozen earth, recovering American dead who had been given hasty battlefield burials when there was no time for proper evacuation. Some bodies were marked with rifles stuck bayonet first into the ground, helmets balanced on top. Others were marked only by disturbed snow. A few were not marked at all, discovered when shovels struck frozen flesh instead of frozen earth. Pryor kept a clipboard and recorded each recovery. Name if dog tags were present, unit identification if visible on uniform, location found, apparent cause of death. By noon, his team had recovered 47 bodies from a quarter-mile radius. The field, Pryor estimated, contained at least 200 more, and this was just one field outside one village in a battle that had sprawled across 50 square miles for 5 weeks. The mathematics of death at Bastogne defied simple accounting because different organizations counted different categories at different times for different purposes. The 101st Airborne Division reported 1,641 battle casualties during the siege, December 20th through 26th. But battle casualties included wounded who returned to duty within days, men who were evacuated never to return, and men who were killed. Breaking that number into categories required cross-referencing morning reports, medical records, and Graves registration files, bureaucratic exercises that wouldn't be completed until months after the battle. The division reported an additional 1,641 casualties during the counteroffensive, December 30th through January 17th, giving a total of 3,282. But this didn't include non-battle casualties, frostbite cases, accidents, disease, psychiatric evacuations. When those were added, the total approached 4,000, more than 1/3 of the division's strength. The other American units that fought at Bastogne had their own casualty lists that intersected with but didn't duplicate the 101st's figures. Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division lost approximately 700 men killed, wounded, and missing. The 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion lost 250. The artillery battalions, the 420th, 463rd, 377th, and 969th, collectively lost over 300. The 87th Infantry Division, 11th Armored Division, and other units that fought to open and defend the corridor lost approximately 5,000 casualties in operations directly related to Bastogne. The final American casualty count for all operations related to Bastogne from December 16th through January 17th exceeded 10,000 men killed, wounded, captured, or missing. The number was approximate because casualty reporting was imperfect, and some men were reported missing who later rejoined their units, while others reported as wounded later died of complications. The frostbite casualties alone told a story about warfare's capacity to destroy without enemy action. Over 2,000 American soldiers received medical treatment for frostbite, severe enough to remove them from combat duty. This didn't include the hundreds who had minor frostbite, blackened toes, frostbitten fingers, but remained with their units because medical evacuations were reserved for cases requiring hospitalization. Of the 2,000 serious frostbite cases, approximately 400 required amputations, ranging from individual toes to entire feet to portions of hands where fingers had frozen and tissue had died. These amputations were battlefield medicine, crude, fast, designed to remove dead tissue before gangrene set in. Some were performed with proper anesthetic in hospitals after evacuation. Others were performed in aid stations with whatever morphine remained. A few were performed by medics in forward positions, using scalpels sterilized over cigarette lighters, because the alternative was watching gangrene spread up the limb and kill the soldier. German casualties at Bastogne proved even harder to calculate, because German record-keeping had collapsed under the pressure of simultaneous offensives on eastern and western fronts. The divisions that fought at Bastogne, 2nd Panzer, Panzerlehr, 26th Volksgrenadier, Führer Brigade, 15th Panzergrenadier Regiment, and others, reported casualties to their parent corps headquarters, which reported to Army headquarters, which reported to OKU. But these reports were often days delayed, sometimes lost in transmission, occasionally falsified by commanders who feared reporting. Accurate losses, post-war analysis based on captured documents, prisoner interrogations, and unit strength reports estimated German casualties at Bastogne between 15 and 20,000 killed, wounded, and missing. The range reflected uncertainty that would never be resolved. Some German soldiers died and were buried by their comrades in unmarked graves. Others disappeared into Soviet prisoner of war camps after Germany's surrender and were recorded as missing for decades. The exact number of Germans who died at Bastogne remained unknown in 1945. And remains unknown today. The equipment losses told their own brutal story. American forces lost approximately 150 tanks and tank destroyers at Bastogne and in operations to relieve it. German forces lost over 250 armored vehicles in the same operations: tanks, assault guns, self-propelled artillery, armored personnel carriers. These weren't machines abandoned intact. They were burning hulks, photographed for after-action reports, gutted shells photographed by Signal Corps cameramen, twisted metal photographed by Graves registration teams, looking for bodies inside. The loss of a tank meant more than the loss of the machine. It meant the loss of a crew, 4 or 5 men in American tanks, 5 or 6 in German tanks. Some crews escaped burning vehicles, many didn't. Tank crews that died inside their vehicles were often burned beyond identification. Their bodies fused to metal that had heated to temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees. These casualties were recorded as killed in action, remains not recoverable, a bureaucratic phrase that concealed horror beyond description. The civilian casualties at Bastogne received less attention than military casualties, but were no less tragic for being incidental. Approximately 782 Belgian civilians died in Bastogne and surrounding villages during the battle. They died from artillery fire while sheltering in cellars. They died from aerial bombardment when Allied aircraft struck targets in populated areas. They died from small arms fire during street fighting. They died from starvation and disease in basement shelters where sanitation failed and food ran out. They died when buildings collapsed on top of them. They died in ways that had nothing to do with military necessity and everything to do with the fact that their homes had become a battlefield. The Belgian government later compiled detailed records of civilian casualties, including names, ages, dates of death, and locations. Reading these records provided terrible clarity. 12-year-old girl killed by artillery in her home's cellar on December 23rd. 73-year-old man killed by rifle fire while attempting to find food on December 28th. 8-month-old infant died of exposure in cellar on January 2nd. The war's human cost was not abstract. It had names and ages and stories that ended in frozen cellars in a Belgian town no one had heard of before December 1944. The long-term casualties, the men who survived Bastogne but were never the same, defied statistical measurement. Psychiatric casualties were recorded as combat exhaustion and numbered in the hundreds. But this captured only the most severe cases, men who became non-functional during the battle or immediately after. It didn't capture the soldiers who developed what later generations would call post-traumatic stress disorder, who returned to duty but carried Bastogne with them for the rest of their lives. These men appeared in casualty statistics as returned to duty, suggesting they had recovered. Many hadn't. They had simply learned to function despite psychological wounds that would never heal. The Veterans Administration would treat these men for decades after the war, but in January 1945, they were simply soldiers who had survived and were expected to continue soldiering. The medical personnel who treated Bastogne's casualties carried their own wounds. Surgeons who performed hundreds of amputations in unheated cellars reported nightmares that persisted for years. Medics who triaged wounded under fire, deciding who would receive treatment and who would be left to die, reported survivor's guilt that manifested as depression and alcohol abuse. Nurses who worked 18-hour shifts treating men whose wounds exceeded anything their training had prepared them for reported emotional detachment that became permanent, an inability to feel that protected them during the war but crippled them afterward. The medical personnel were not counted as casualties because they hadn't been shot or blown up, but they had been damaged in ways that statistics couldn't measure and bureaucracy couldn't acknowledge. The final accounting came in February 1945, when the War Department compiled casualty reports for congressional briefings. The numbers were presented as bullet points. American casualties at Bastogne, approximately 10,000. German casualties, approximately 18,000. Civilian casualties, approximately 800. These numbers appeared in reports and newspapers and history books, becoming the official record, but they were lies of precision, suggesting certainty where only estimates existed. The true cost of Bastogne could not be captured in numbers because numbers couldn't measure what it costs to dig frozen corpses from snow, to amputate a soldier's feet in a cellar by flashlight, to watch men die from wounds that would have been survivable in peacetime, to live in a foxhole for 3 weeks at temperatures that medical science said should have killed everyone involved. The numbers were necessary because military bureaucracy required quantification, but they were also insufficient because they reduced human suffering to statistics and human death to accounting problems. Captain Pryor finished his work in the field outside Foy on January 23rd. His team had recovered 212 bodies from that one field alone. Each was placed in a body bag, tagged with whatever identification was available, and transported to the American Military Cemetery, being established at Henri-Chapelle in Belgium. Some bodies were identified immediately through dog tags or personal effects. Others required fingerprint analysis or dental records. A few were never identified and were buried as unknown, believed to be American soldier. Pryor moved to the next village and began the process again. He would spend the next 3 months recovering bodies from the Bastogne battlefield, working systematically through villages and fields and forests. He would recover over 1,500 bodies total. And for the rest of his life, when people asked what he did in the war, he would say graves registration and change the subject because explaining what that meant, explaining what it meant to dig frozen corpses from Belgian snow in the winter of 1945 was impossible. Some experiences could not be transmitted. They could only be endured. And Pryor, like thousands of others who fought at or worked around Bastogne, would endure them privately, carrying the weight of things no one else could see. January 28, 1945. In the operations room at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force in Versailles, staff officers moved colored pins on a wall-sized map of Western Europe and contemplated a question that would occupy military historians for decades. Had Bastogne mattered? The map showed Allied forces having eliminated the German salient in the Ardennes. The front line was roughly where it had been on December 15th, before the offensive began. Germany had lost over 100,000 casualties and 600 tanks trying to reach Antwerp. The Allies had lost approximately 75,000 casualties stopping them. In purely tactical terms, the Battle of the Bulge, as it was already being called, was a draw. Both sides had suffered terribly. Neither had gained significant territory, but the strategic implications were entirely one-sided. Germany had expended its last reserves, accomplishing nothing. The Allies had absorbed heavy losses but maintained strategic momentum. And at the center of this equation sat Bastogne, a town that had become either the most important factor in German defeat or an expensive sideshow, depending on who was analyzing the battle. The German perspective on Bastogne's significance was unambiguous because German commanders said so explicitly in captured documents and post-war interrogations. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding 5th Panzer Army, wrote in his January 20th assessment that Bastogne had paralyzed the offensive's operational freedom by forcing German forces to either assault the town or maintain siege forces that should have been exploiting the breakthrough. He calculated that 7 German divisions, approximately 60,000 men, had been committed to Bastogne operations between December 20th and January 15th. These divisions could have reinforced the drive toward the Meuse River or defended against Patton's counteroffensive from the south. Instead, they were tied down attacking and defending around a Belgian market town. Von Manteuffel's analysis concluded, Bastogne decided the offensive's failure more than any other single factor. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, reached similar conclusions through different logic. His January 25th assessment focused on timing rather than forces. The operational plan for Wacht am Rhein called for 2nd Panzer Division to reach the Meuse River by December 20th. 2nd Panzer actually reached Dinant, on the Meuse, on December 23rd, 3 days late. Model calculated that this delay was directly attributable to Bastogne operations. 2nd Panzer had been delayed 1 day fighting. Around Bastogne on December 19th and 20th, delayed another day waiting for roads through Bastogne to be cleared, delayed a 3rd day by having to detour around the town when it didn't fall. Those 3 days allowed American reinforcements to reach the Meuse and establish defensive positions. Model's conclusion, if Bastogne had fallen December 20th as planned, 2nd Panzer Division would have crossed the Meuse in force. The subsequent battle would have developed differently. The fuel situation provided perhaps the clearest measure of Bastogne's strategic impact. German forces in the Ardennes Offensive consumed fuel at rates far exceeding pre-operation estimates. The operational plan assumed capture of American fuel dumps would supplement German logistics. The largest accessible fuel dumps were at or near Bastogne. When Bastogne didn't fall, those dumps were either destroyed by retreating Americans or remained in American hands. 2nd Panzer Division reached Dinant with less than 20% fuel remaining. Panzer Lehr Division was immobilized by December 27th for lack of fuel. Multiple German accounts described tanks being abandoned, not because they were destroyed, but because they had run dry. The failure to capture Bastogne meant the failure to capture the fuel that would have sustained the offensive's momentum. In mechanized warfare, this was equivalent to a death sentence. The Soviet offensive that began January 12th on the Eastern Front provided brutal context for Bastogne's strategic significance. On that date, Soviet forces launched Operation Vistula Oder, a massive offensive across the entire Polish front. German intelligence had warned that this offensive was coming. German commanders had requested permission to withdraw forces from the Ardennes to defend the Eastern Front. Hitler had refused, ordering that the Ardennes offensive continue until it achieved its objectives. When the Soviet offensive hit, Germany had no reserves to stop it. The forces that should have been defending Poland were tied down at Bastogne or recovering from losses in the Ardennes. Within 3 weeks, Soviet forces had liberated Poland and reached the Oder River, 30 miles from Berlin. The strategic trade-off was stark. Germany had sacrificed its Eastern Front defense for an Ardennes offensive that failed to achieve its objectives. Bastogne was not solely responsible for this strategic catastrophe, but it was part of the equation. The resources consumed fighting for Bastogne were resources unavailable to stop the Soviets. The counterfactual analysis, what would have happened if Bastogne had fallen, produced multiple scenarios, all speculative but all instructive. Scenario 1. Bastogne falls, December 20th as planned. 2nd Panzer Division pushes through the town, reaches the Meuse by December the 21st, establishes bridgeheads. American reinforcements arriving from the north, 82nd Airborne, and south, Patton's Third Army, face a German penetration that has already reached its objective. Best case for Germany. The Meuse crossing holds for a week before collapsing. Worst case, it collapses immediately. Either way, Germany has not split the Allied armies or reached Antwerp. The strategic outcome remains German defeat, but the operational timeline changes by perhaps 2 weeks. Scenario 2. Bastogne is bypassed entirely, left as an isolated American garrison in the German rear. 2nd Panzer Division maintains its timeline, possibly reaching the Meuse by December 19th or 20th. But American forces in Bastogne interdict German supply lines, attack German rear areas, and force allocation of siege troops anyway. This was Model's preferred option. He had argued for bypassing Bastogne in late December, but it carried its own risks. American forces in the German rear had historically proven difficult to contain, as German experiences with paratroopers at Normandy had demonstrated. The bypass option might have saved time but created operational complications that were difficult to quantify. Scenario 3. The most optimistic German scenario, where everything goes according to plan. Bastogne falls December 20th. 2nd Panzer Division reaches the Meuse, December 20th. The weather remains overcast through December 25th, preventing Allied air intervention. German forces establish multiple Meuse bridgeheads and begin the drive to Antwerp. In this scenario, German operational success is maximized, but even here, strategic failure seems likely. The Germans would have outrun their logistics by December 27th. The Americans would have fed reinforcements into defensive positions faster than Germans could deploy offensive forces. The British would have committed armored reserves to stop the advance. At best, Germany reaches Antwerp in early January and faces immediate counterattacks. At worst, more likely, German spearheads are cut off and destroyed west of the Meuse. Even optimal execution of Wacht am Rhein probably ends in German defeat. The American perspective on Bastogne evolved from tactical problem to strategic validation. In late December, American commanders saw Bastogne as an operational necessity, a town that had to be held to maintain supply lines and prevent German freedom of maneuver. By late January, they saw it differently. Bastogne had become proof that American forces could absorb strategic surprise, improvise effective responses, and hold critical terrain against determined assaults. Eisenhower's January 30th assessment described Bastogne as demonstration of American military flexibility and determination under conditions that would have broken lesser forces. This was partly public relations. Eisenhower needed to justify heavy casualties. But it was also accurate. The defense of Bastogne had shown that American forces in winter 1944 were fundamentally different from the inexperienced armies that had struggled in North Africa in 1942. The material balance sheet told its own story. Germany had committed approximately 250,000 men to the Ardennes Offensive. They had sustained over 120,000 casualties, lost 600 armored vehicles, lost 1,600 aircraft, and expended ammunition and fuel stockpiles that could not be replaced. The material Germany lost in the Ardennes was material unavailable to defend against Allied offensives in February and March. The men Germany lost in the Ardennes were men unavailable to defend the Rhine crossings. The time Germany spent in the Ardennes was time that allowed the Soviets to advance 500 kilometers into German territory, and Bastogne sat at the center of this equation, the town whose defense consumed German resources that should have been exploiting breakthrough, the anchor that held while Allied forces reorganized. The final strategic assessment appeared in British military analysis dated March 1945, as Allied forces prepared to cross the Rhine. The British analysis noted that Germany had effectively lost the war in the West by January 1945, not because it lacked forces, but because it lacked the capacity to conduct strategic operations. The Ardennes Offensive had been Germany's last strategic reserve, and its failure meant Germany could now only defend reactively. The analysis attributed this outcome to multiple factors: Allied material superiority, German logistics failures, weather that favored the Allies, and, critically, the successful defense of key terrain at Bastogne, which prevented German exploitation of initial success. Bastogne had not won the war, but it had ensured Germany could not alter the war's outcome through desperate offensive action. The men who fought at Bastogne would spend decades debating whether their sacrifice had been necessary. Some concluded it had been, that holding Bastogne prevented a German breakthrough that might have prolonged the war by months. Others concluded it had been expensive theater, that Germany would have lost regardless of Bastogne's outcome. The historical record suggests the truth lay between these extremes. Bastogne mattered because it consumed German resources and bought time for Allied responses. It mattered because its defense demonstrated American capability to recover from surprise and improvise effective operations. It mattered because it became a symbol that affected morale across all Allied forces. But it did not single-handedly decide the battle or the war. It was one factor among many, important but not determinative, significant but not sufficient. The men who died there died for a town that mattered, but they died in a battle that was already being decided by factors larger than any single town could control. And that, perhaps, was the most honest assessment possible. Bastogne was worth defending. But no town, however bravely defended, could change the strategic mathematics that had been running against Germany since Stalingrad. The war would end in German defeat. Bastogne determined how that defeat would unfold, not whether it would occur. June 6, 1949. At the premiere of Battleground at Radio City Music Hall in New York, 800 veterans of the Battle of Bastogne sat in the audience watching Hollywood's version of their experience. The film showed paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division, surrounded by Germans, fighting through snow and cold, ultimately holding their ground until Patton arrived. The film showed the nuts response to the German surrender demand. It showed aerial resupply breaking through overcast. It showed tired men in foxholes doing their jobs despite impossible conditions. And it showed, in the final scene, the surviving soldiers marching past civilians who looked at them with respect. When the film ended, the audience applauded. The veterans did not. They filed out in silence. Later, journalists asked what they thought. Most said the same thing. It wasn't like that. When pressed for details, they changed the subject. The gap between memory and representation, between lived experience and cultural artifact, was already unbridgeable. The legend of Bastogne was being constructed even before the battle ended. War correspondents attached to 8 Corps headquarters evacuated west before the encirclement and filed stories based on intelligence reports and official briefings. These stories emphasized American defiance, German aggression, and the dramatic tension of besieged forces awaiting relief. The stories were not false. They were based on actual events, but they were simplified, dramatized, and structured according to narrative conventions that transformed messy reality into compelling storytelling. The nuts response became headline material because it was quotable and defiant. The airborne mystique provided ready-made heroes. The weather provided atmospheric drama. The relief by Patton provided climax. All the elements of effective narrative were present. The only thing missing was complexity. The first full historical account appeared in 1946, written by Army historians using official records and after-action reports. This account was more accurate than Hollywood versions, but still shaped by institutional requirements. The Army needed Bastogne to be a triumph, because triumph justified casualties. The account emphasized American tactical competence, leadership effectiveness, and the vindication of airborne doctrine. It minimized things that reflected poorly on institutional performance, the intelligence failures that allowed strategic surprise, the supply failures that left soldiers counting bullets, the command confusion that characterized the battle's first days. The official history was not propaganda. It was based on documentary evidence, but it was selective in what evidence it emphasized. The result was an account that was factually accurate but tonally misleading, suggesting the defense of Bastogne had been difficult but orderly when reality had been chaotic, bordering on collapse. The veterans themselves contributed to the legend through selective memory and communal reinforcement. Reunions of the 101st Airborne Division began in 1946 and continued annually thereafter. At these reunions, veterans shared stories, and certain stories were told repeatedly while others were rarely mentioned. Stories about combat heroics were acceptable. Stories about terror and confusion were not. Stories about holding against odds were welcome. Stories about nearly breaking were avoided. This was not conscious conspiracy. It was social dynamics. Veterans wanted to remember experiences that gave meaning to suffering, not experiences that suggested suffering had been pointless. So, the shared memory that emerged from these reunions emphasized agency, courage, and effectiveness. The doubt, fear, and randomness that characterized actual combat experience faded from collective memory, even as individual veterans remembered them privately. The Belgian relationship with Bastogne's memory proved complex. The town itself became a memorial, with street names honoring American units and monuments marking where significant events occurred. The people of Bastogne staged annual commemorations where veterans returned to receive honors from grateful civilians. This narrative, American liberators, Belgian gratitude, was emotionally satisfying for both groups, but it obscured uncomfortable realities. Belgian civilians had suffered tremendously during the battle. Approximately 800 died. The town was 80% destroyed. Many Belgians lost everything. And the battle itself had been caused not by German desire to harm Belgium, but by German desire to defeat America and Britain. Belgium was incidental terrain, its people collateral damage. The grateful Belgians honoring American heroes narrative was not false, but it was incomplete, a version of events that served commemorative purposes while avoiding harder questions about who pays the cost when great powers fight over small countries. The Cold War shaped Bastogne's memory in ways that became clear only decades later. In the 1950s and 60s, as the United States confronted the Soviet Union, Bastogne became a symbol of American willingness to hold critical terrain against totalitarian aggression. The parallels were explicit in public discourse. Just as American forces held Bastogne against Nazi Germany, so would American forces hold West Berlin, South Korea, South Vietnam against communist expansion. Politicians invoked Bastogne in speeches. Military leaders referenced it in planning documents. The battle became not just historical event, but contemporary metaphor. This metaphorical use reinforced certain aspects of the legend: American determination, willingness to suffer for principles, confidence in ultimate victory, while obscuring others. The fact that Bastogne had been improvised response to intelligence failure, that it had nearly ended in disaster, that its strategic significance was debatable, these complexities disappeared in favor of simpler narrative about American resolve. The personal legacies of individuals who fought at Bastogne varied dramatically. Some veterans built successful post-war lives, using the discipline and leadership skills they had learned in the army to succeed in business or education. Others struggled with physical injuries, amputations, chronic pain from old wounds, disabilities that limited employment options. Still others struggled with psychological wounds that 1945 medicine did not recognize or treat effectively. The Veterans Administration files contain thousands of cases where Bastogne veterans sought treatment for what was variously called combat exhaustion, nervous condition, or anxiety disorder, terms that captured symptoms but not causes. By the 1980s, when PTSD became recognized diagnosis, many Bastogne veterans were finally receiving treatment for conditions they had carried for 4 decades. But some never received treatment, carrying their wounds privately until death. The material evidence of the battle faded slowly. The German tanks destroyed around Bastogne were cut up for scrap metal in the 1950s. The American vehicles were salvaged or buried, the foxholes weathered and filled with leaves and dirt. The villages were rebuilt, often on the same foundations, but with new structures. By the 1970s, a visitor to Foy or Noville would find modern Belgian villages with few visible signs of the battle. The only persistent evidence was in metal detectors finding expended brass and shrapnel, in farmers occasionally plowing up unexploded ordnance, in foundations of buildings showing pockmarks from small arms fire. The physical evidence was being erased by time and development. What remained was memory, and memory was being shaped by forces independent of historical accuracy. The evolution of Bastogne historiography showed how professional historians struggled with the gap between legend and reality. Early histories, written in the 1950s, largely accepted the heroic narrative. Later histories, written from the 1980s onward, with access to German documents and critical methodology, presented more complex pictures. These later histories emphasized contingency, how close Bastogne came to falling, how improvised the defense was, how much luck contributed to the outcome. They emphasized cost, the terrible casualties, the suffering of civilians, the long-term consequences for survivors. They emphasized context, how Bastogne fit into larger strategic picture, why it mattered, but also why it wasn't as decisive as legend suggested. But these scholarly histories reached academic audiences, not general public. The popular understanding of Bastogne remained shaped by battleground, by band of brothers, by commemorative speeches. The legend persisted because legends serve psychological and cultural needs that complexity cannot satisfy. The final generation of Bastogne veterans began dying in the 2000s. By 2010, most were in their 80s or 90s. By 2020, only a few dozen remained alive. The 50th anniversary in 1994 drew thousands of veterans to Bastogne. The 60th in 2004 drew hundreds. The 75th in 2019 drew barely more than 200, many in wheelchairs, many requiring assistance to participate in commemorations. The men who had been 18 or 22 years old at Bastogne were now 93 or 97. They were the last witnesses, the final holders of experiential memory. When they died, all that would remain was recorded memory, documents, photographs, films, oral histories. And those records, however comprehensive, could never capture what it meant to be there. One of the last surviving veterans, interviewed at age 98 in 2023, was asked whether Bastogne had been worth it. He sat quietly for a long time before answering. Finally, he said, "We held the town. People say that mattered. Maybe it did. But I remember the men who died. I remember their names. I remember burying them in frozen ground. And I think, did they die for something that mattered? Or did they just die? I don't know. I was there, and I don't know." He paused again, then added, "But they did their jobs. We all did our jobs. Maybe that's all you can say. We were given a job and we did it. And some of us survived and some didn't. That's war. That's all war ever is." The complexity that veteran expressed, the uncertainty, the doubt, the absence of clean answers, was what the legend of Bastogne had been constructed to avoid. Legends require clarity. They require heroes and villains, triumph and defeat, meaning and purpose. Reality provides none of these things reliably. Reality provides men in foxholes trying to survive, officers making decisions with incomplete information, battles that are won or lost based on factors no one can control. The legend of Bastogne says American forces held critical terrain against overwhelming odds through courage and determination. The reality is more complex and less satisfying. American forces held critical terrain through combination of competence, luck, enemy mistakes, and willingness to accept terrible casualties. Both statements are true, but only one provides the narrative satisfaction that culture demands. As the last veterans aged and died, the question emerged, who would remember Bastogne when the witnesses were gone? The answer was, everyone and no one. Everyone would know the story, the encirclement, the nuts response, the aerial resupply, Patton's relief. These elements had entered cultural memory and would persist. But no one would know the experience, what it felt like to be cold for 3 weeks straight, to count bullets, to watch friends die and know you might be next, to fight not for abstract principles, but simply because stopping meant death. That experiential knowledge would die with the last veteran, and when it died, Bastogne would complete its transformation from historical event to cultural symbol, a story told to illustrate lessons about courage and determination, disconnected from the messy, terrifying, contingent reality that the men who were there had experienced. The final assessment of Bastogne must hold both legend and reality in tension without resolving them. The legend says Bastogne was a triumph of American arms, proof that American soldiers could hold critical terrain against determined assault. This is true. The reality says Bastogne was desperate improvisation that nearly failed, that cost thousands of lives, that mattered strategically, but perhaps not as decisively as memory suggests. This is also true. The men who fought there were both heroes and victims. Heroes for doing their jobs under conditions that tested human limits. Victims of strategic decisions they didn't make and outcomes they couldn't control. Their sacrifice bought time that mattered in a battle whose outcome was probably already determined. They held a town that became famous precisely because holding it seemed impossible, and they carried the weight of that experience for the rest of their lives, knowing that what they had done mattered, but uncertain exactly how much it mattered, or whether the cost had been justified. That uncertainty, that gap between what we want war to mean and what war actually is, may be the most honest truth about Bastogne. It was important. It was terrible. It was both necessary and tragic. And those contradictions can never be resolved, only acknowledged, and honored in memory of the men who endured them.